Clara Bennett pressed her back to the cold marble wall and willed the tears not to fall, because in that ballroom a single tear would be a feast for people who had already picked her bones clean. 10 summers she had stood invisible. 10 summers no man had crossed the floor for her. Then the richest man in Virginia set down his glass, and every eye followed him, not to the beauties, not to the heiresses, but to her. Before you watch how far this story travels, subscribe, follow it to the very end, and tell me in the comments which town you're watching from. The music did not stop when William Carter began to walk. It only seemed to. To Clara Bennett, standing where she always stood against the wall near the servants' door, close enough to slip out unseen when the shame grew too heavy. The whole grand room narrowed to the sound of one man's boots crossing polished wood. She did not look up right away. She had learned long ago that hope was a thing you paid for later, and she could not afford the bill. 10 paces behind him, the widow Ashford leaned toward Prudence Vale and did not trouble to lower her voice. "He'll pass her by. Watch, he always passes the wall." "Poor Clara," Prudence murmured in that soft, cruel way she had, the way you'd pet a dog you meant to kick. "She still wears her mother's gloves. Did you see mended at the seam?" Clara's fingers curled. The gloves had been her mother's. The seam had been mended by Clara's own hand 3 nights ago by candlelight because the family could not spare a new pair, could not spare the candle either, and she had done it anyway because a Bennett did not arrive at the Carter summer ball with bare hands. She fixed her eyes on the far window and told herself the burning behind them was the heat of the room. 10 seasons, the widow said, warming to it. 10 seasons that girl has come to every assembly in this valley and gone home in the same chair she came in. There's a mercy in staying home, I always say. Some flowers were meant to bloom in the shade. The word found its mark the way the widow had aimed it. Wallflower. Clara had been called it so many times it had stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a name. She lifted the glass of lemonade she had been holding for an hour, untouched, warm now, and pretended to drink so that her face would have something to do besides break. That was when the boots stopped. They stopped in front of her. For one full breath, Clara did not understand it. She thought perhaps he had come for the punch table behind her or to speak with the Vale sisters, who had drifted magnetized to her elbow the moment they smelled the possibility of scandal. She kept her eyes on the window. If she did not look, she could not be disappointed. That was the arithmetic she lived by. "Miss Bennett." His voice was low, and it was meant only for her. Every head in the near circle turned. Prudence's painted smile froze halfway to her cheek. The widow Ashford's fan stopped moving. Clara looked up. William Carter was standing so close that she could see the fine gray thread in his coat, the kind of gray that cost more than her father's whole harvest. He was not smiling the smile the men here used on women, that lazy, appraising smile that measured a face and a dowry in the same glance. He was not smiling at all. His jaw was set. His eyes, dark and steady, were fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, because no one had looked directly at her in so long that she had forgotten what it did to a person to be seen, and there was a tear on her cheek. She felt it now, one single traitor tear that had escaped while she wasn't guarding the gate. He saw it. "Don't cry," he said, very quietly. Just those 2 words pitched beneath the music so that no one else could take them and use them against her. "Don't cry, Miss Bennett. Not for them." Clara's whole body went still. In 10 seasons, the richest man in Virginia had never once spoken to her. Not a word, not a nod. She had watched him from the wall through a dozen summers, watched him bow over the hands of women wrapped in silk and secured by fortune, and she had understood, everyone understood, that a man like William Carter moved through rooms like this one, the way a river moves through a valley, indifferent, obeying only his own course. He had turned down heiresses. He had turned down the governor's own niece, it was said, and left 3 counties gossiping for a year. William Carter did not choose. He was chosen from and found everyone wanting, and now he stood before the one woman no one had ever chosen at all, and he had told her not to cry. "Sir," Clara managed. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Pride did that sometimes. It stiffened the spine when everything softer had already failed. "I'm quite well. The heat, that's all." "The heat," he repeated. "Yes. There's a breeze off the north windows," he said. "It isn't the heat." She had no answer for that. He had caught her in a small lie and handed it back to her without cruelty, and that alone was so unfamiliar that she did not know where to put it. Behind her, Prudence recovered enough to speak. "Mr. Carter," she said, sliding forward, tilting her chin so the candlelight caught the jewels at her throat. "How good of you to grace us. Millicent and I were just saying how—" "Miss Vale." He inclined his head a fraction of an inch. It was the barest courtesy a gentleman could offer and still be called a gentleman, and everyone in the circle knew it. Then he turned back to Clara as though Prudence Vale had been a chair someone had thoughtlessly left in the path. "Miss Bennet?" He held out his hand. Not palm down the way a man offers his hand to lead. Palm up. Open. An offering, not a command. "May I have this dance?" The room did not go quiet gradually. It went quiet all at once, the way a struck bell goes quiet when you close your hand around it. The musicians in the gallery kept playing, but the talking stopped the champagne laughter. The fan-flutter whispers, the whole silken machinery of the Carter Summer Ball simply ceased, and 40 faces turned to see whether they had heard the impossible thing correctly. Clara looked at the open hand, then at his face, then helplessly past his shoulder to where Margaret Carter sat enthroned among the matrons at the head of the room. She had never met William Carter's mother. She had only ever seen her the way one sees weather from a safe distance and with respect for its power to ruin a day. Margaret Carter did not attend these assemblies to dance. She attended to watch, to weigh, to keep the ledger of who was rising and who was falling, and to make certain that the name Carter stayed at the top of every column. And Margaret Carter was watching now. Her face had not moved. That was the terrible thing. A lesser woman would have gasped or frowned or half risen from her chair. Margaret Carter only looked with 2 eyes as cool and gray as her son's, and in that stillness, Clara read something worse than anger. She read calculation. She read a woman deciding in real time exactly what this would cost, and exactly who would pay. "Mr. Carter," Clara said, and she pitched her own voice low now, to match his, so that this at least could be between the two of them. "You needn't do this." His brow drew down. "Do what?" "Whatever it is." Her chin came up. 10 years against the wall had taught her a great many things, and one of them was how to keep her dignity even while it was being taken from her. "If it is a wager, sir, or a jest, if one of your friends bet you couldn't cross the floor and ask the Wallflower to dance, then you've won it. You crossed. You asked. Everyone saw. You may keep your coin, and I'll keep my seat, and we'll both be spared the rest." A muscle moved in his jaw. For a moment, she thought she had offended him past the point of manners, and she braced for whatever came next, because she had braced for worse. But William Carter did not withdraw his hand. "There's no wager," he said, quietly, evenly. "There's no jest. There's no friend of mine in this room, and I don't gamble." A pause. One of those pauses that a plain man fills with nonsense and a serious man leaves standing. "I asked because I wished to dance with you, Miss Bennet. Nothing more complicated than that. Now." His hand stayed open, steady, patient, as though he could hold it there all night. "Will you let me, or would you rather I stood here until your friends have thought up something clever to say about it?" She almost laughed. It surprised her, a small, startled thing that got only halfway to her lips before she caught it. But it changed something in her, that near laugh. It cracked the ice she'd frozen herself in. She looked at his open hand one more time. Then she set down the warm, untouched glass of lemonade she had carried like a shield for 1 full hour, and she put her mended glove into the palm of the richest man in Virginia. The circle around them broke into sound like a dam giving way. She heard the widow Ashford say, "Well, I never," in a voice like a slap. She heard Prudence say nothing at all, which was somehow worse. And then William Carter's fingers closed warm and sure around her hand, and he drew her out from the wall she had held for 10 summers, out onto the open floor where the whole valley could see her, and the terror of it nearly stopped her heart. He must have felt her tremble because as they took their places, he bent his head and spoke again for her alone. "Look at me," he said. "Not at them. At me. They can't touch you if you're looking at me." "That's not true," Clara whispered back. Her feet found the first steps out of 10 years' habit and old lessons half forgotten. "They can always touch you. That's the whole trick of them. There's nowhere in this room they can't reach." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or recognition. Spoken like a woman who knows. "I've had the schooling." They danced. She had expected him to be stiff, the way powerful men often were moving through the figures, as through an obligation. He was not. He danced the way he had crossed the room with a certainty that asked no one's permission, and he kept his eyes on her the entire time, and slowly, terribly, Clara understood that he was not going to look away. He was not going to release her after one turn and deliver her back to the wall with his duty done. He meant to dance the whole of it. "Everyone is staring," she said. "Yes. You don't mind?" "I've been stared at my whole life, Miss Bennet," he said. "For my name, for my land, for what's in the ground I own and the ships I've a share in. You learn to let it pass through you." His hand pressed lightly at the small of her back to turn her and released. "Though I confess it's the first time in 10 years they've stared at me for something I actually wanted to do." She missed a step at that. He caught her before it showed, steadied her with a pressure at her waist and a slight sure lean, and no one watching would have known. "Why?" she asked. The question came out of her before she could stop it, low and fierce and honest. "Why me? And do not tell me it was the heat, sir, or my eyes, or any of the things men say when they mean nothing at all. You've passed this wall for 10 summers. You've passed me. Why tonight? Why do you even know my name?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His gaze moved across her face, careful the way a man reads a page he does not want to misunderstand. "You truly don't know me," he said at last. It was not quite a question. "I know you're William Carter, and I know your mother owns half the county's mortgages, and I know a woman like me has no business being on this floor with a man like you," Clara said. "That's the whole of my knowledge, sir, and it's more than enough to know how this ends." "No?" He shook his head slowly. "That's not what I meant." The music swelled, and they turned, and when they came back together, his voice had dropped even lower. "Last April, the marsh road past your father's fields. There was a storm, the worst of the spring. Do you remember it?" Clara's feet kept moving, but somewhere inside her everything stopped. "There was a man," William went on, watching her face very closely now. "Caught on the road in that storm. His horse had gone lame, thrown a shoe in the mud, and he was soaked through and half out of his head with fever by the time he reached the first lit window he could find. He knocked. It was your window, Miss Bennet. Yours and your father's. A poor farmhouse with a leaking roof and not enough of anything, and a stranger on the step with mud to his knees and no name he was willing to give." "Stop," Clara breathed. He did not stop. "A young woman opened the door," he said. "She should have turned him away. Any sensible woman alone with an old father would have barred the door against a fevered stranger in the dark. Instead, she brought him inside. She put him by the only fire they had. She fed him the supper that was plainly meant for 2, and stretched now to feed 3. And when he was ashamed of taking it, she told him. I remember it exactly. 'Miss Bennet,' she said, 'a body doesn't ask a hungry man for his pedigree before it feeds him. Eat.' Clara's eyes were burning again, and this time she could not blame the heat, and she could not look away from him, because he had told her to look at him, and now she found she could do nothing else. She nursed that fever 3 days, William said. She sat up 2 nights running with cold cloths. She never once asked who he was, or where his money was, or what he might be worth to a girl with a failing farm. She asked only whether he was warm enough, and whether the fever had broken, and whether he had people who'd be frightened for him. And on the third day, when the fever passed and he was strong enough to ride, she gave him her own father's cloak against the cold, because his was ruined, and she would take no coin for any of it, not a penny. She said, his voice caught just slightly, the only unsteady thing about him all night. She said kindness that's paid for isn't kindness, it's commerce, and she'd not sell hers. The room was gone. The staring faces were gone. There was only his voice and the impossible thing it was telling her. "That was you," Clara whispered. "That was me. You never gave your name." "I couldn't," he said. "You'll understand why. If I'd told a poor family with a mortgage that the man dripping on their floor was William Carter, whose mother held their note, everything would have changed. The food would have been given differently. The fire built differently. You'd have looked at me differently, and I would never have known." He stopped, started again. "I'd have gone my whole life never knowing there was one house in this valley where a Carter was fed for no reason, but that he was hungry, and warmed for no reason, but that he was cold, and where the woman of the house scolded him for being ashamed of it." His jaw tightened. "Do you know how long it has been, Miss Bennet, since anyone did a single thing for me without first counting what it might return?" She shook her head. She didn't trust her voice. 10 years, he said. 10 years near enough. Since before my father died and left me the whole of it, the land, the mills, the name, the ledger, my mother's expectations, and a valley full of people who look at me and see a fortune wearing a coat." His hand tightened on hers. "And then one wet night in April, a farm girl on the marsh road looked at me and saw a cold, sick man who needed supper. Just that. A man." His eyes held hers. "I have spent 5 months trying to find the courage to cross a ballroom and say thank you. Tonight I finally did." The dance was ending. Clara could hear it in the music, the long descending figures that meant the couples would soon part, and she was seized by a wild grief that it should end, that she should be handed back to the wall, now with this new impossible knowledge lodged in her chest like a splinter of light. "You shouldn't have," she said. "It came out broken. Do you understand what you've done? They'll never let it lie. By tomorrow, every parlor in the county will be saying, 'William Carter danced with the pauper girl,' and they'll make it ugly and it won't touch you. Sir, it never touches men like you, but it will fall on me. It always falls on me. You'll have your thank you, and I'll have—" "Then let them talk." "I'll have a ruin I didn't ask for," she finished. "You didn't rescue me tonight, Mr. Carter. You lit a fire under my chair and called it a gift." He stared at her, and to her astonishment, something in his face gave way. Not anger, but a kind of stricken understanding, as though it had genuinely never occurred to him in all his wealth and his careful 5 months of courage that his gratitude might cost her more than her kindness had ever cost him. He began. The last chord fell. The dancers bowed. And into the space where his answer should have gone stepped Margaret Carter. She had crossed the room without seeming to hurry, and yet she was simply there at her son's elbow, in a gown the color of iron with her son's eyes and none of his softness. Up close, she was handsomer than Clara had expected, and colder, a woman built like a well-kept house, all the warmth locked somewhere deep inside where no visitor was permitted to go. "William," she said. Just his name, but there was a whole sentence folded inside it. "Mother." He straightened, and Clara watched something happen to him that she recognized in her own bones, the way a person braces, the way the spine remembers old obedience, even when the mind has moved past it. "May I present Miss Clara Bennet? Miss Bennet. I know who she is." Margaret's gaze moved over Clara once top to bottom in a single unhurried sweep that took inventory of the mended gloves, the twice-turned hem, the dancing slippers dyed to hide their age, and came to rest on Clara's face with an expression of perfect remote courtesy. "You are Thomas Bennet's daughter." "I am, ma'am." Clara curtsied. Low correct, giving the woman nothing to fault. "It's an honor." "Is it?" Margaret said it flatly, not a question, and let the small silence do its work. Then to her son, without turning her head. "You've had your dance, William. I imagine Miss Bennet's father will be wanting her home. It's a long road to the marsh and the hour's getting on, and a girl in her position can't afford to be careless about the hours she keeps. The cruelty was so smooth Clara nearly missed it. A girl in her position. 2 words, and Margaret Carter had reminded the whole listening circle exactly what position that was, and reminded Clara that the great lady knew precisely where she lived on precisely which failing road, and had troubled to say so out loud. Mother. There was warning in it now, low and real. I'm only thinking of the girl William. Margaret's smile did not reach anywhere near her eyes. People are unkind. You know how they talk. It would grieve me to see Miss Bennet made the subject of talk she doesn't deserve. She turned back to Clara, and her voice did not change at all, which was what made it so frightening. You do understand me, don't you, child? You seem a sensible sort. I'm told you keep your father's books yourself, that you've a head for figures. A woman with a head for figures can add a sum as well as anyone. So I'll trust you to add this one. Ma'am, Clara said quietly, I don't believe I follow you. No. Margaret tilted her head. Then I'll be plain since we're neither of us fools. My son has a kind heart and a poor memory for consequences. He's done you a great honor tonight, and honors of that kind have a way of leaving marks on the ones who receive them long after the man who bestows them has forgotten. He'll wake tomorrow and go to his mills and his ships and his 1,000 cares, and by supper this dance will be one small thing in a large life. Her gray eyes held Clara's without a flicker. But you'll wake tomorrow, Miss Bennet, in a house with a mortgage I hold the paper on a road that floods with a father whose harvest failed 2 years running, and this dance will be the largest thing that has happened to you in a decade, and the whole county will know it, and they will not be kind. So. The smile again, exquisite and empty. Which of us do you suppose the sum falls hardest on? Clara felt the blood leave her face. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the sheer breathtaking accuracy of it. Every word was true. That was the weapon. Margaret Carter had not needed to lie. William's voice cut in hard now. That's enough. It is more than enough. Margaret agreed pleasantly, still looking at Clara. Which is why I've said it, and now I'll say no more, and we can all be spared an ugly scene. Miss Bennet understands me. Don't you, child? You understand what's kind, and what only looks kind. And Clara, who had spent 10 years learning to make herself small. 10 years swallowing insults with a curtsy. 10 years choosing the safe silence over the costly word. Clara opened her mouth to say, Yes, ma'am, of course, ma'am, and slip out the servant's door she had kept always at her back for exactly this. But she looked at William Carter's face first. She had not meant to. But she did, and she saw there something she had not expected: shame. Not shame of her, shame for his mother and for himself, and for a whole way of living that measured every human soul by the paper in a strongbox. He was looking at Clara with a plea in it. Not a plea for her to stay, she understood, but a plea for her not to be broken by this, not to shrink, because it was plain he had seen her not shrink once before on a wet April night, and it had changed something in him he could not undo. And so what came out of Clara Bennet's mouth was not yes, ma'am. You're right, Mrs. Carter, she said. Her voice was very clear. It carried further than she'd meant it to, into the quiet, greedy circle that had gathered close to feast on her ruin. About all of it. You hold the paper on our house. Our harvest failed. Our road floods. I do keep my father's books, and I've a head for figures, and you've reckoned every sum tonight correct to the penny. She lifted her chin. But you've left one figure out. Something shifted in Margaret Carter's face. The smallest thing. A stillness that had not been there. Have I? She said. You have, ma'am. Clara's heart was slamming, but her voice held because she had discovered in the last 10 seconds that there was a place a person could go right at the very bottom past fear, where the only thing left was the truth, and it was strangely quiet down there. You've reckoned what this dance costs me. And you're right. It'll cost me a great deal. It'll cost me my peace and maybe my good name in a valley that's never once been kind to a Bennet who couldn't pay for kindness. I know that. I knew it before your son ever crossed the floor. She held the older woman's eyes. But you've reckoned it as though my peace and my name were the only things I own. As though a woman with an empty purse must therefore have an empty soul, and can be added and subtracted like a column of your figures. And there, Mrs. Carter, with all respect there, your arithmetic fails you, because I've been poor my whole life, ma'am, and I've never yet been for sale, and I'll not start being sold tonight, not even to spare myself the talk." She curtsied again, lower than before. Perfect, unhurried a curtsy that somehow managed to be the least submissive thing anyone in that room had ever seen. "Good evening to you, and thank you for the honor of being reckoned so carefully. Not many trouble to." The silence that followed had weight. Clara could feel it pressing on her skin. She did not wait for a reply. She turned not to the servant's door at her back, the coward's door she had used for 10 years, but toward the great front doors, the ones the guests came through, the ones a Bennet was not supposed to be worth the trouble of, and she walked toward them with her spine straight and her mended gloves folded in front of her, and the crowd astonished parted to let her pass. Behind her, she heard William Carter say, low and shaking with something she could not name, "Mother, do you see now? Do you see what you nearly did?" And she heard Margaret Carter say nothing at all. Clara made it to the door. She made it down the wide steps and out past the line of waiting carriages, past the grooms and the torches, and the murmur that was already rising in the ballroom behind her, like water coming to a boil. She made it to the plain hired trap, where old Silas, her father's man, dozed on the bench, and she woke him gently and climbed up and said, "Home. Silas, please." And it was only when the wheels began to turn and the Carter house fell away behind her into the summer dark that Clara Bennet let herself shake. She shook the whole of the marsh road. Not from fear, though there had been fear. Not from grief, though she'd earned some grief tonight. She shook because for the first time in 10 years she had stood in the middle of that gilded room and not disappeared. She had been seen, really seen, seen down to the bone, first by the son, and then by the mother. One with tenderness and one with a blade. And she had not vanished. She had stood there. She had answered. She had, God help her, said what was true out loud in front of all of them, and the sky had not fallen. "You're crying, Miss Clara," Silas said gently, not turning around the way a kind old man gives a person privacy even while he offers comfort. "I know it, Silas. Bad night, was it?" Clara wiped her face with the back of her mother's mended glove and looked up at the enormous, indifferent stars, and she found that she was impossibly, almost smiling. "No," she said. Her voice was raw and small and entirely her own. "No, I don't reckon it was." At the Bennet farmhouse, there was one window, lit the same window a fevered stranger had knocked on in an April storm, and behind it, Thomas Bennet was waiting up in his chair with a blanket over his bad leg. The way he waited up every assembly night to hear how his girl had fared, and every assembly night for 10 years she had come home and told him it was fine, Papa. It was a fine evening, so that he would not know how they treated her, so that his heart would not break over a thing he had no money to fix. Clara stood on the step a long moment before she went in. Her hand rested on the door. Her own kindness had once opened to a stranger who turned out to own half the county. She did not yet know what William Carter would do next, or what his mother would do, or what the valley would make of a farm girl who'd told the richest woman in Virginia that she was not for sale. She did not know that the paper Margaret Carter held on this very house would soon become the whole battlefield, or that the figures in her father's ledger, the figures she kept so carefully by candlelight, held a truth that would one day silence a ballroom far more thoroughly than anything she'd said tonight. She knew only this. She had spent 10 summers learning to be invisible, and in one night, a man had looked at her and refused to let her vanish, and she had discovered that she was tired, so tired of vanishing. Clara Bennet pushed open the door. "Papa," she called softly into the lamplight. "Papa, I'm home, and I've a great deal to tell you." By morning, the whole valley had the story, and it had grown teeth on the way. Thomas Bennet heard it from the miller's boy before he'd finished his coffee, and he set the cup down so hard it cracked the saucer. "He did what?" the old man said. "Danced with her, Mr. Bennet, William Carter himself. Crossed the whole floor, the boy says, and left the Vale girls standing there with their mouths open like a pair of caught trout. The boy was breathless with the joy of it. And then Miss Clara begging your pardon, Miss Clara told the old Mrs. Carter she weren't for sale plain as day in front of everybody, and walked out the front doors like she owned 'em. Thomas turned in his chair slow on account of the bad leg, and found his daughter standing in the kitchen doorway with a wooden spoon in her hand, and flour on her apron, gone still as a fence post. "Is that true, Clara?" "The dancing's true," she said. "And the front doors. The rest of it he's improved on some, but not by much." The boy, sensing he'd delivered a keg of powder, and lit it besides, took his leave. Thomas waited until the door shut. "You told me it was a fine evening," he said, "last night. You came in and said you'd a great deal to tell me, and then you told me it was a fine evening and you went up to bed." "I did." "That weren't a great deal, Clara. That were nothing at all." She came and sat across from him and put the spoon down and folded her hands, and for a moment she was 10 years old again caught. "I didn't know how to say it, Papa. I still don't. A man I've never spoken to in my life crossed a room I've stood at the edge of for 10 years, and he told me not to cry, and he asked me to dance, and I danced with him. And his mother told me very kindly, very quietly, that I'd best remember my place, that she holds the paper on this house, and that a girl in my position ought to be careful about the hours she keeps and the honors she accepts." Clara's jaw tightened, "And I told her she'd left a figure out of her arithmetic, and then I came home." Thomas was quiet a long moment. His hand, spotted and thick-knuckled, found hers on the table. "Margaret Carter said that to you? About the paper on the house?" "She did. In front of people." "In front of most of the county, Papa." The old man closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something in his face she didn't often see. Not the tiredness she'd grown used to, not the shame he carried about the failed harvests, but a flash of the man he'd been before the crops went, and the money went, and the strength went out of his leg. "Then it's begun," he said, "and it'll not stop till it's finished, because that woman does not begin things she means to lose." He gripped her hand harder. "What did he want, Clara Carter? A man like that don't cross a room for nothing. What did he want with you?" And here Clara hesitated, because there was a thing she had not told anyone, a thing she had held to herself all night like a coal in a cold hand. "He was the man in April," she said quietly. Thomas frowned. "What man in April?" "The one in the storm. The stranger with the lame horse and the fever that knocked at our door. The one I sat up with, that I fed, that took your old cloak and rode off before dawn, and never gave a name." Clara looked at her father. "That was William Carter." The old man's mouth opened and closed. "The richest man in Virginia," he said slowly. "Slept 3 nights by our fire and ate our supper, and we never knew it. He wouldn't tell us on purpose. He said if we'd known who he was, it would have changed everything, the food, the fire, the way we looked at him. He said he wanted to know if there was one house in the valley where a Carter would be fed just for being hungry." Her voice caught. "And now he's found it, and he set the whole county on us as his thank you." Thomas Bennett, who had lost 2 harvests and a wife and the use of half his body, and had wept over none of it, in front of his daughter, sat at his cracked table and turned his face to the window so she wouldn't see. "Then God help us," he said, "because there is no gift so dangerous as one from a Carter." He was more right than he knew, and he found out how right before the sun was high, because that was when the rider came up the marsh road. Silas saw him first from the yard, and came stumping to the door faster than his years should have allowed. Miss Clara, there's a man coming up on a gray horse, a fine horse, and he ain't dressed like a bill collector." Clara went to the window, and her heart did a thing she was cross with it for doing. It was William Carter. He rode up alone, no groom, no company, and he swung down at the broken gate and did not wait to be received. He tied the gray to the post himself, a man who had 100 men to tie his horse, and did it with his own hands, and he came up the path to the door of the poor farmhouse in the full light of morning, where anyone passing on the road could see him, and he took off his hat. Clara opened the door before he could knock. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Good morning to you too, Miss Bennett." "I mean it. You've done enough. Half the county saw you dance with me, and the other half's heard about it by now. And if they see your horse tied at my father's gate in daylight, there won't be enough of my name left to bury." She kept her hand on the door. "Go home, Mr. Carter." "May I come in?" "No." "Miss Bennet, you cannot fix what you did to me last night by doing more of it today," she said, and it came out sharper than she meant, because she was frightened, and being frightened made her cruel. "Every hour you stand here, you make it worse. Can you not see that a man like you doesn't lose anything by being kind to a girl like me? You go home to 5,000 acres and a name nobody can touch. But I don't go anywhere. I stay here on this road in this valley, and I pay for your kindness in the only coin they'll take from me, which is my reputation, and I've precious little of it left to spend." For a moment, William Carter stood on her step with his hat in his hand, and took that full in the chest, and to his credit, he did not flinch from it. "You're right," he said. Clara blinked. What? You're right. I've thought of nothing else since you walked out those doors. I lay awake the whole of the night turning it over, and every way I turned it, you were right and I was a fool. I came here thinking a man of honor sets things straight, and it wasn't until I was halfway up your road that I understood I'd learned nothing at all, that I was about to do the very thing again. Ride up, be seen, make you the talk, cost you more, and call it setting things right. His jaw worked. "So I'll go. In 1 minute I'll go, and I'll not come back up this road in daylight where it can hurt you. But I'll not go before I've said one thing, because I owe you a truth, and I've been a coward about it long enough." "Mr. Carter, my mother means to call in the note on this house." The words dropped into the morning like a stone into a still pond. Clara's hand went slack on the door. "What?" "I heard her tell Crane last night, after you'd gone." His voice was flat and hard, the voice of a man reporting a wound. "Josiah Crane, my land agent. He manages the mortgages, the tenancies, all of it. She told him to bring the Bennett note current for review. Those were her words. Bring it current for review. And I know what that means, Miss Bennett, because I've heard her say it before about other families. It means she means to press it. It means that within the month, a man will come up this road with a paper, and he'll ask your father for a sum your father cannot pay. And when he cannot pay it, the law will take this house and the fields and the roof over that old man's head. And it will all be perfectly legal and perfectly quiet. And it will be my mother's answer to a girl who told her she wasn't for sale." Clara felt the ground move under her. She'd take the house, she said, over a dance, over the principle of the thing. My mother doesn't lose. She told me so herself when I was 9 years old at my father's graveside with her hand on my shoulder, like a manacle. His mouth twisted. "A Carter does not lose, William. Remember it. I've spent my whole life remembering it. And now she's aimed the whole of it at you and I—" He stopped. His hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I will not let her. Do you hear me? I don't know how yet. But I will not stand by and watch her put an old man out of his house because his daughter had the courage I've been trying to buy my whole life. I won't." "Downey, how will you stop her?" Clara's voice shook. "You just said it yourself. It's legal. It's quiet." She holds the paper. "What's the son going to do? Beg his mother buy the note off her out of your own pocket so I can trade one Carter's charity for another's? I told you last night, sir. I'm not for sale, and I meant her, but I meant you too." That landed. She saw it land. "Then help me find another way," he said. "There isn't one. There's always another way. You of all people know that. A woman who kept her father's failing farm alive 2 years past the point every man in this valley said it should have died. You know there's always another figure. You said it yourself last night to my mother's face. You left one out. What was it?" And Clara Bennett, standing in her doorway, with the ruin of her name blowing toward her up the marsh road, looked at William Carter for a long, long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "But you'll tie that fine horse in the barn where it can't be seen from the road. And you'll not stay past an hour. And this is not you rescuing me, Mr. Carter. Understand that going in. If there's a way through this, I'll be the one that finds it, and you'll be the one that fetches and carries when I tell you to. Those are my terms." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to see to his horse. That was how William Carter came to be sitting at Thomas Bennett's cracked kitchen table an hour later, with a cup of chicory coffee in front of him and a ledger open between him and the old man's daughter, learning the second thing about Clara Bennett that changed the course of his life. The first had been that she would feed a stranger for nothing. The second was that she was the sharpest mind in the county, and nobody had ever once thought to ask her opinion about anything. "These aren't just your father's books," William said. He was turning the pages slowly, and his brow had furrowed because he had a head for numbers himself, and he was beginning to see something in them. "These are whose is this the Hollis farm, and this the Doan place. Marsh Road, both of them. You're keeping their accounts." "I keep books for 6 families now," Clara said. She didn't look up from the column she was totaling. "Started with the Hollises 2 winters back, when Eli Hollis broke his arm and couldn't write, and his wife never learned her figures. I did it for a sack of cornmeal and the loan of their mule at planting. Word got round. A woman'll do a thing cheaper than a man, and I do it better so." She shrugged one shoulder. 6 families. "I know every debt on this road, Mr. Carter. Every note, every rate, every payment due. I know it better than the men that owe it because they can't bear to look at it, and I can't afford not to." William sat back. 6 families worth of debt," he said slowly. "All of it owed to my mother's estate, to Crane's ledger." "To Crane's ledger," Clara agreed. And then she said the thing that changed everything, and she said it without knowing it was the thing, the way a person will sometimes set down the one true word in the middle of a plain sentence. "Which is queer now I think on it, because Crane's figures never once match mine." The room went very still. "Say that again," William said. Clara looked up. Something in his voice had gone taut. "His figures don't match mine. The interest, I mean, on the notes." She frowned. "I always reckoned I had it wrong. He's the Carter agent, he's got the trained men and the proper books, and I'm a farm girl doing sums by a tallow candle. When my number came out lower than his, I figured I'd dropped a payment somewhere or missed a term in the contract. So I just paid what he said and never argued it. What's a Bennett going to do? Argue arithmetic with a Carter?" She said it lightly. Then she saw his face. "What? Mr. Carter, what is it?" "Show me," he said. Low, urgent. "The Hollis note. You said you keep it. Show me the contract, and then show me your figures against Crane's." She got them. She spread them on the table, the original mortgage in its stiff legal hand, her own careful running tally in pencil, and beside it, the statement, Crane's office, sent each quarter, with the sum owing. William Carter bent over the 3 of them for a long time, and Thomas and Clara watched him do it. And the only sound in the house was the old man's clock and the flies at the window. At last, William looked up, and his face had gone the gray of ash. "Miss Bennett," he said, "your figures aren't wrong." "What? You didn't drop a payment. You didn't miss a term. Your arithmetic is perfect. It's Crane's that's wrong." His finger came down on the agent's statement, and it was shaking. "He's charging the Hollises interest on interest, compounding a note that was written to run simple. Look here and here. The contract says 6% on the principal. Crane's been charging 6% on the whole balance every year, the principal and the unpaid interest both, and rolling it forward, so the debt grows faster than any honest farm could ever pay it down. It's Clara, it's not an error. You don't make the same error the same direction for 4 years running. This is done a purpose. This is a man robbing these families a nickel and a dime at a time, quiet over years, and figures nobody poor enough to owe them would ever dare to question." Clara's hand had come up to her mouth. "The Hollises paid him $40 last spring," she whispered. $40, Mr. Carter. Eli sold his good plow horse for it, his good horse. And you're telling me, I'm telling you they didn't owe it, not the half of it. I'm telling you, a man who works for my family out of an office that flies my name has been bleeding this whole road white for years and calling it my mother's due." William's voice had gone terrible and quiet. "How many did you say 6 families you keep books for?" 6. "And how many notes does Crane hold in this valley?" Clara's eyes were huge. "Dozens," she said. 40, 50. More." The two of them looked at each other across the table, and the whole shape of the thing rose up between them, enormous and dark. "Then this isn't about a dance," William said slowly. "This was never about a dance. My God, you've been keeping the only honest books on this road for 2 years, and you're the only person in this county who could ever prove what he's doing, and last night—" He stopped. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time all over again. "Last night, my mother told Crane to bring the Bennett note current for review. She thinks she's punishing a girl who embarrassed her. But Crane heard something else, didn't he? Crane heard that a man was about to open the Bennett books. Crane heard the one set of figures in the valley that would catch him was about to be dragged into the light. The clock ticked. "You have to go," Clara said suddenly. She was on her feet. "You have to go now, Mr. Carter. If what you're saying is true, if that man's been stealing for years, and he knows I could prove it, then he's not going to wait for the law, he's going to—" A fist hammered on the door. All 3 of them froze. "Bennett," came a voice from the yard. A man's voice, oily smooth, pitched to carry. "Thomas Bennett, Josiah Crane, come up from the Carter estate on business. Open the door, if you please. I've a matter regarding your note that won't keep." Clara's eyes flew to William. William was already moving, but not toward the door. Toward the back of the house, toward the little pantry off the kitchen, and he caught Clara's arm on the way and put his mouth close to her ear. "He can't find me here," he breathed. "If he knows I've seen the books, it's finished, he'll run or worse. Get me out of sight. Let him say his piece, learn what he wants, and Clara—" His hand tightened on her arm, and his voice was fierce. "Don't you let on. You know a single thing, not one thing. Whatever your face wants to do, don't let it. You've hidden what you feel in front of worse than him for 10 years. Do it once more." And then he was gone, folded into the dark of the pantry, and the fist hammered the door again, and Clara Bennett smoothed her apron with 2 hands that did not shake, because she would not let them, and she opened the door on the man who had been robbing the whole of the Marsh Road for 4 years. Josiah Crane was a soft-looking man, round and pink and pleasant, with small, clean hands and a smile that had never once meant anything. He held his hat against his chest in a show of manners and looked past Clara into the house with quick, mild, greedy eyes. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Good morning. Is your father to home? It's himself I'll need." "He's resting his leg, Mr. Crane." Clara stood square in the doorway. She did not open it wider. "You can leave your business with me. I keep his accounts." "Ah." Crane's smile widened a hair. "Yes, so I'd heard. You keep a good many accounts, don't you, Miss Bennett? Quite the little bookkeeper. It's remarked upon." He let that sit a beat too long. "May I come in?" "You may say your piece on the step." Something flickered behind the pink and pleasant face. Annoyance quickly smoothed. "As you like. I'll be brief then, since you're a busy woman." He drew a folded paper from his coat with those small, clean hands. "The estate is reviewing its outstanding notes. Yours is among them. I'm afraid the sum owing has come due for settlement, and the figure well." He clucked his tongue, all false sorrow. "The figure is larger than I imagine your father's aware. Compounded over the years, you understand, these things do mount." "Do they?" Clara said. "They do. $216 as of this quarter." Behind her, in the dark of the pantry, she heard the smallest sound, a breath drawn hard through the nose. $216. She kept her face perfectly still. She had had 10 years of practice. "That's a great deal of money, Mr. Crane." "It is, Miss Bennett. It surely is. Which is why I've come myself as a kindness ahead of the formal papers. The estate would prefer not to distress a respectable family." His voice dropped into something confidential and sticky. "There may be arrangements for a family willing to be reasonable, cooperative. A family that understands the estate's goodwill is worth more than any sum on a page and takes care not to spend that goodwill foolishly. On foolish talk, say, or foolish company. His mild eyes rose to her face. You take my meaning. And there it was. Not the mortgage. The threat wearing the mortgage like a coat. Be quiet, girl. Keep your father's house by keeping your mouth shut. Forget whatever the rich man's whispered in your ear, and don't you dare go looking too close at any figures but your own. Clara Bennett looked at the soft pink man on her step, who had sold Eli Hollis's plow horse out from under him a dime at a time, and every part of her wanted to say, I know what you are. I have your theft written in pencil on my own kitchen table, and I will see you hang for it. She said none of it. I take your meaning, Mr. Crane, she said, and let her eyes drop, and let her shoulders round the way. A beaten woman's shoulders round, and hated the doing of it, even as she did it. We're a reasonable family. We want no trouble. I'll speak to my father about the sum. Crane's smile bloomed, satisfied, sure of her, the way such men are always sure of the poor. There's a sensible girl, he said. I knew you'd see it plain. You always were the clever one out this way. He tucked the paper back in his coat. I'll call again at the quarter's end. See that your father's ready. And Miss Bennett. He settled his hat back on his round head. Do give my regards to any fine gentleman who might come calling. Handsome gray horse in your barn, I noticed. Coming up the yard. Fine animal. Costs a deal to keep a horse like that. His eyes held hers mild as milk. Wouldn't want folk to talk. He knew. He'd seen the horse. Clara's heart slammed once hard, but she did not so much as blink. That's the Hollis's horse, Mr. Crane. I'm boarding it while Eli's arm mends. But you'd know all about Eli's arm, I expect, and what it cost him. The smallest crack in the pink smile. Just for an instant. Then it closed over smooth again. Good day, Miss Bennett, Josiah Crane said, and turned and went down the path and mounted his own horse and rode off down the marsh road at an easy pace, in no hurry, at all a man who believed he had won. Clara shut the door and put her back against it, and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor, and only then did she let herself shake. William came out of the pantry. He crossed to her and went down on his heels in front of her, and he did not touch her, only looked at her, and his face was stricken with a kind of awe. $216, he said. Clara, the true sum, the honest sum. On that note, simple interest, the way it was written, it's not $80. He's charged your father $136. That doesn't exist. On one note. One family. His voice cracked. And you sat there. You put your eyes down and made yourself small in front of that man. And you gave nothing away. And you did it to protect me. And I have never in my life seen anything as brave as that. And I have never in my life been so ashamed of my own name. He saw your horse, Clara whispered. I heard. He knows William. Maybe not that it's you, but he knows there's a man, and he knows I've been near your books now, and he's frightened under all that oil. He's frightened I could hear it. She gripped his wrist. Which means he'll move. Men like that always move when they're frightened. He'll call the note faster. He'll press us before I can prove a thing and take the house and put my father in the road. And then who'll believe a homeless girl's pencil marks against the whole Carter estate? I'll believe them. You're a Carter. You can't testify against your own family without folks saying you did it out of spite or worse out of some scheme to marry beneath you. Her mind was racing now, that quick, sharp mind he'd only just begun to see the size of running the columns of the thing the way she ran a ledger. No, it can't be your word. It has to be the figures. It has to be so many figures from so many families all pointing the same way that no man alive could call it a mistake or a spite or a lie. We need the notes, William, not just mine. All of them. Every one Crane holds. If I could lay them next to the true contracts. They're in his office, at the estate, under lock and under his own hand. Then we get them. William stared at her. Clara, that office is in the east wing of my own house, my mother's house. Crane's there half the day, and when he's not, his clerk is. You can't just... I don't mean to walk in and take them off the shelf. Mr. Carter, I'm not a simpleton. Clara was on her feet now, energy pouring off her, 10 years of being told to sit down and be quiet, burning off her all at once. I mean the quarterly statements, the ones he sends out. Every family on this road has one, and I keep half of them already. If I gather the rest quiet family by family on account of I keep their books anyhow, nobody'll think a thing of it. And I lay every one against the original note, and I total the theft family by family in a hand, so plain a child could follow it. She turned to him, and her eyes were blazing. Then it won't be my word against a Carter's. It'll be Crane's own figures against Crane's own figures. His own hand hanging him. And there's not a lawyer nor a magistrate in Virginia can argue with a man's own arithmetic. For a moment, William Carter just looked at her, at this woman who'd stood at the edge of his ballroom for 10 years, while he passed her by, this woman a whole county had decided was worth nothing because her purse was thin. "Do you know," he said quietly, "I think you might be the most dangerous person I have ever met." I'll take that as it's meant, if it's meant kind. It's meant kind. And then, because he was a Carter, and had never in his life been able to sit still inside a plan without wanting to command it, he added, "I'll help. I've access to the estate they'll never question. It's my own home. I can walk into that east wing any hour I please. I can get you the notes you can't reach, the original contracts, the ones in the strongbox. If I bring you those and you bring me the statements, then we've the whole of it." "No," he blinked. "No, you'll not go into that office." Clara said it flat. "Not yet. Think, William. You said it yourself. Crane's frightened. A frightened thief watches his own back. If you start turning up in his wing, poking at his strongbox, going near his papers, he'll know inside a week. And then he does move, and he doesn't take just my house. He takes the evidence and burns it and runs, or he goes to your mother first with some lie that turns her against both of us." She shook her head. "You have to be exactly what you've always been to him. A young master with no head for the books who leaves the money to Crane, like his father did, who's got no interest in the East Wing, beyond the wine that's stored near it. You have to be the William Carter he's not afraid of. Can you do that?" The muscle in his jaw worked. It cost him something she could see a proud man being asked to play the fool in his own house. "For how long?" "Until I've got enough of the statements gathered that it doesn't matter what he burns. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll work fast." She met his eyes. "But it means you can't come up this road, William. It means what I told you at the door this morning, that you go home and stay away, is truer now than it was then. If Crane connects the gray horse in my barn to William Carter, we're finished before we've begun. Whatever this is, whatever last night was, it has to stop on the outside, where anyone can see it. You have to go back to being the man who danced with a wallflower once out of pity and thought better of it." She said it steady. She was proud of how steady she said it. William Carter was quiet a moment. "And on the inside?" he asked. Clara looked away first. "I've a great deal of work to do, Mr. Carter," she said. "And so have you." He took that. He didn't press it, and she was grateful, because if he'd pressed it, she wasn't sure what she'd have answered. He gathered his hat. At the door at the barn, rather where the gray was hidden, he stopped and turned back. And for a moment the whole careful plan fell away, and there was just a man looking at a woman across the floor of a poor barn, as though it were the finest ballroom in Virginia. "When it's done," he said, "when Crane's answered for it and your father's house is safe, and the whole road's got back what was stole from it, when there's no more reason for me to stay off your road." "Don't," Clara said softly. "Don't make a promise standing in a barn, William. Promises made in barns don't survive the walk back to the big house. I've seen it happen to better women than me." She managed something that was almost a smile. "Go and be a fool for me. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do, and nobody'll ever know it but us." He looked at her one moment longer. Then he swung up onto the gray, and he was gone back down the marsh road, toward the world that had never once made him prove his worth. And Clara Bennett went back inside to her father's cracked table, and pulled the ledgers toward her, and got to work. The 2 weeks that followed were the busiest of Clara's life, and the strangest, because she had never before had a reason to be busy that felt like this, that felt like walking a wire over a canyon, terror and joy at once. She went family to family up and down the marsh road under the cover of her ordinary work. She had an excuse to be at every kitchen table in the valley. She'd been keeping half these books for 2 years, and the other half welcomed her gladly, because a girl who'll set your accounts straight for a jar of preserves is a friend to a family that can't afford a clerk. "I'm just tidying everyone's papers against the quarter, Mrs. Hollis," she'd say. "Bringing it all up level. You keep the statements Crane's office sends, the quarterly ones good. Let me just copy off the figures, save you the worry of it." And family by family, statement by statement, she built it. It was worse than she'd feared. It was so much worse. The Hollises robbed of $130 over 4 years. The Doanes near 200. Old widow Pruitt, who lived on nothing and owed on a note her dead husband had signed, cheated of every dollar of interest she'd paid, because the note had been settled in full 3 years back, and Crane had simply kept collecting, kept sending statements, kept taking a frightened old woman's egg money for a debt that no longer existed. Clara found that one at 11 o'clock at night and had to put her pencil down and press both hands over her mouth to keep from crying out loud in the sleeping house. He hadn't just padded the debts. On some of them, the ones owed by folk too old or too broken to fight, he'd invented the debt hole. She wrote it all down. In her plainest hand in columns, a child could follow family by family, what the note truly said, what Crane had charged, and the difference between them, which was the measure of the theft. And at the bottom of each page, she wrote the true sum, owing, or in widow Pruitt's case, the sum Crane owed her. The stack of it grew. And with every page it grew more dangerous to keep, because it was in the end a document that could hang a Carter's own man, sitting in a farmhouse Margaret Carter meant to seize inside the month. She kept it in the one place she reckoned no man would think to look, sewn into the lining of her mother's winter cloak in the trunk at the foot of her bed, under the summer things that wouldn't be touched till the cold came. She did not see William. That was the hardest part, and she was cross with herself for its being hard. He kept his word. He stayed off the road. But twice in those 2 weeks a boy came up from the town with a message, the miller's boy, who could be paid in cornmeal to hold his tongue, and the messages were nothing on their face. Estate business. Miss Bennet. Mr. Carter asks after the Hollis's horse. And folded inside in a fast, strong hand, 3 words the boy couldn't read and wouldn't have understood if he could. Still a fool. And the next time, fool still. And you. And Clara had laughed out loud alone in her kitchen, at that. Laughed till her eyes stung, and sent back with the boy a single word. Braver, and spent the rest of the day unable to stop smiling, which frightened her more than Crane did, because she knew what it meant, and she knew what it would cost her when the barn promise didn't survive the walk to the big house. The way they never did. Then, at the end of the second week, 2 things happened close together, and after them, there was no more pretending it was only figures. The first was that Eli Hollis found out. Clara hadn't meant for anyone to know what she was building. It was too dangerous. The fewer that knew, the safer. But Eli Hollis was no fool, and when Clara came to copy his statements for the 3rd time in a fortnight, and asked him careful questions about a note he'd signed 6 years back, and went pale at his answers, Eli set down his mended arm and looked at her hard across his own table. "Clara Bennet," he said, "what is it you're really about?" And Clara, who had held her tongue in front of Crane, who had held it in front of the whole county for 10 years, found she could not hold it in front of Eli Hollis, who had lost his good plow horse to a lie. "He robbed you, Eli," she said quietly. "Crane. The $40 last spring. The horse. He robbed you and the Doanes, and the Pruitts, and half this road, and he's been doing it for years, and I can prove it, and I mean to." The big man went still. Then his hand, the good one, closed slowly into a fist on the tabletop. "How much?" he said. "Of yours, $130 near enough. Over 4 years." Eli Hollis was a quiet man, a gentleman, a man who'd never raised his voice to wife nor beast in 20 years. He sat at his table and looked at his own fist, and when he spoke, his voice had gone so low and so terrible that Clara felt it in her back teeth. "My boy," he said, "my oldest. He wanted to marry the Tanner girl last fall. Couldn't. No money. We'd paid it all to Crane. Told him wait a year, wait till we're square with the estate. He looked up, and his eyes were wet and furious. We'll never be square, will we? There ain't no square. He made sure of it. My boy lost his girl and I lost my horse, and it was all a lie, a soft man wrote in a book. He stood up from the table. Where is he? Sit down, Eli. I'll break every soft bone in his... Sit down! Clara was on her feet too, and there was iron in it, and the big man stopped. You heard him? You hang and Crane wins twice, he keeps the money, and he's rid of the man who caught him. Is that what you want? Your wife a widow of a hanged man, and Crane laughing over both your graves? She held his eyes until the fury in them broke and turned to grief. No, we don't do it with fists. We do it with his own figures in front of a magistrate, where he can't wriggle and he can't run, and every soul on this road gets back what's theirs. But I need you calm, Eli, and I need you quiet, and I need you to say nothing to nobody, because if it gets out before it's ready, he burns the books, and we've nothing. She softened. Can you do that for your boy? For the Tanner girl he's still sweet on? Eli Hollis stood in his kitchen with his one good fist and his broken heart, and slowly, he unclenched the hand. He said hoarse. For my boy. I'll be quiet. And then, looking at her, this girl the whole valley had written off standing in his kitchen, with the power to write 4 years of quiet theft, Clara Bennett. All this time we thought you was just a poor girl good with sums, and you was... He shook his head wondering. You was the only one of us paying attention. That was the first thing. The second thing happened 2 days later, and it happened at night, and it changed everything. Clara was at her table past midnight, with a single candle adding the final column. The great total, the sum of all of it, every dollar Josiah Crane had stolen from the Marsh Road. And it came to a figure so large she'd had to check it 3 times because she could not believe a soft pink man could steal so much so quietly from people who had so little. She heard the horse before she heard the knock, not the gray. She knew the gray's step by now, God help her. She'd have known it in her sleep. This was a different horse ridden hard blown, and it came up the Marsh Road at a gallop in the dead of night and slid to a stop in her yard, and Clara was up with the candle in one hand and her father's old flintlock in the other, before the rider had even dismounted, because no one rides a horse like that at midnight to bring good news. The knock when it came was frantic. Miss Bennett, for God's sake. She knew the voice, the miller's boy, but wrecked sobbing almost nothing like the sly, cheerful lad who carried her cornmeal messages. She threw the door open. The boy stood in the candlelight white as a sheet chest heaving, and he had a paper crushed in his fist and he thrust it at her. From Mr. Carter, he gasped. He said run. He said kill the horse if you have to, but get it to you tonight before morning, he said. Everything depends on tonight. Clara took the paper with a hand gone suddenly cold. She unfolded it by the candle. It was the fast, strong hand, but it was not steady now. It slashed and tore across the page like it had been written at a run. Clara Crane went to my mother tonight. I heard it through the door. He's told her you're gathering the notes. He's told her you and I are plotting to ruin the family, that you seduced me at the ball, to get at the books, that it's a scheme to blackmail the estate. She believes him, Clara. She has always believed him. Tomorrow at first light she sends the sheriff to your house, not for the mortgage, to search it. Crane's convinced her you've stolen estate papers, that whatever you have is proof of your plot and not his theft, and she means to have it seized and you charged. Everything you've built, they'll take it and call it stolen, and turn it into the very weapon they'll hang you with. You have until dawn. The candle shook in Clara's hand. At the bottom, scrawled so hard the pen had nearly gone through the paper, 4 more words: I'm coming. Hide it. Behind her in the dark of the house, she heard her father's voice, thin and frightened, roused by the noise. Clara, what is it, girl? Who's come? And Clara Bennett stood in her open doorway in the dead of the summer night, with the whole of Josiah Crane's guilt sewn into a cloak upstairs, and the sheriff coming at dawn to steal it and turn it against her, and she did the only thing there was left to do. She did not cry. She did not freeze. She turned to the shaking boy and put the flintlock down and made her voice as steady as the candle was not. "Go home," she told him. "You were never here tonight. You never carried me a thing. If anyone asks, you were asleep in your father's mill." She pressed a coin into his hand and closed his fingers over it. "Go on now, and thank you. You've done a braver thing tonight than most men do in their lives, and one day I'll tell you so proper." The boy fled. Clara shut the door. She stood one breath with her back against it and her eyes closed. Then she opened them, and she looked at her old father clinging to the doorframe in his nightshirt, and she looked at the candle, and she looked up the dark stairs toward the trunk, where a dead woman's cloak held the only justice the marsh road would ever get. "Papa," she said, "get dressed, quiet and quick. We've work to do before the sun comes up and we haven't got long." They had until dawn, and Clara spent the first hour of it doing the one thing no one would expect. She copied everything. "You're going to sew it back where it was," Thomas whispered. He sat at the table with the cloak across his knees, his old fingers working the seam loose, while Clara wrote by candlelight faster than she'd ever written in her life, her hand cramping her letters small and hard. "Clara, they're coming for that cloak. They're coming for whatever's in this house. If you put it back—" "I'm not putting it back, Papa. I'm making it worth nothing to take." She didn't look up. Her pencil flew. "Think. Crane's told your Margaret Carter I've stolen estate papers. So the sheriff comes and he searches and he finds a stack of figures in a woman's hand. What does that prove? Nothing. A clever girl's scribbles. They'll take it and burn it and call it my forgery, my plot, just like the note said. One copy in one house is a thing they can make disappear." Now she looked up, and her eyes were fierce in the candle. "But 3 copies in 3 houses, they don't know to search that they can't disappear. That's not evidence they can burn. That's a fire they can't put out." Thomas stared at his daughter. 3 houses. The Hollises. Eli already knows. He'll die before he gives it up." She kept writing. "And Widow Pruitt, nobody in the county would ever think to search a poor old woman's cottage. And Crane robbed her worst of all, she'll guard it like scripture. That's 2. This house is the 3rd, and this is the one they'll tear apart, so this is the one that holds the copy. That doesn't matter." A grim thing crossed her mouth. "Let them find something. Let them find a copy. It'll make them sure they've won, and it'll make them stop looking for the 2 that'll hang them." The old man's hands had stopped on the seam. He was looking at her the way William had looked at her across the barn, the way Eli Hollis had looked at her across his table, the look of a person realizing they had lived beside a fire for years and mistaken it for a candle. "Where did you come from?" he said softly. "You're my girl, and I raised you, and I swear to God I don't know where you came from." "I came from a house where I had to count every penny or we'd starve," Clara said. "You made me this, Papa. You and Mama, and 10 years of nobody thinking I was worth talking to. Turns out, when nobody talks to you, you get a great deal of time to think." The pencil stilled a moment. "Now finish that seam. We've 2 copies to carry, and less than 4 hours of dark to carry them in." They did it in the dark and the dew. Thomas couldn't ride not with the leg, so it fell to Clara. Clara, who saddled Silas's old mule herself at 2 in the morning, and rode first to the Hollis place where Eli met her in the yard in his nightshirt with a lantern and a face like thunder, having half expected this night to come. "He moved then," Eli said. It wasn't a question. He moved. The sheriff comes at dawn to search my house and sees whatever I've built and call it my crime instead of his. She pressed the oilcloth packet into his big hands. "This is a copy of the whole of it, Eli. Every family, every dollar, the true notes against Crane's lies. If they take mine and burn it, this is what's left. Guard it. Don't tell your wife where. Don't tell your boy. If they come here, and they might, if Crane's clever. You know nothing. You've seen nothing. You're a farmer with a broke arm and no head for figures." Eli Hollis held the packet against his chest, like it was one of his children. "And if it comes to it," he said low, "if it comes to a magistrate, you'll want a man to stand up and say aloud what was done to him." "I will. Then I'll stand up." His jaw set. "Whatever it costs. My boy lost his girl over this. I'll stand up in front of God and the county and every carter that ever drew breath and say what that soft devil stole from us." He looked at her. "You just get me to the room where I can say it, Clara Bennett. You get me there and I'll do the rest." She was on the mule and gone before he finished writing for the Pruitt cottage with the second copy, and the dark thinning to gray at the edges of the sky. And the whole time, one thought beat in her like a second heart. Faster, faster, the sun is coming, and the sun brings the sheriff. Widow Pruitt was awake when she got there. The old woman was always awake. She slept in snatches, like the old and the frightened do, and she opened her door on the first knock with her white hair in a plait and her dead husband's Bible clutched to her chest. "Clara Bennett," she breathed. "In the dead of night. Child, what's happened?" Clara told her fast in the doorway. And when she got to the part about the money, when she said the words Mrs. Pruitt, he had no right. "Your husband's note was paid in full 3 years back, and Crane's been taking your egg money for a debt that doesn't exist. He owes you, ma'am. He owes you every dollar he's squeezed out of you since the old woman's face did something Clara would remember the rest of her life. It crumpled. Then it hardened. Then it caught fire. Since Harold died," Widow Pruitt whispered, "I have gone without meat. I have gone without a fire in October to have one in January. I have sold my hen's eggs, and at none myself, and told the Lord it was His will I be poor." Her old hand, thin as a bird's foot, closed around Clara's wrist with surprising strength. "And you're telling me it weren't the Lord's will? It were a fat man in a warm office with a pen?" "Yes, ma'am." The old woman was quiet a long moment. Then she took the oilcloth packet from Clara's hands, and she wrapped it inside the cover of her dead husband's Bible, and she held the Bible to her chest, and she said in a voice gone terribly steady, "Let them come search a widow's house. Let them. I'll meet them at the door with Harold's good book, and I'll dare them to take the word of God from my hands." Her eyes glittered. "This'll keep, child. This'll keep till you need it. And when you need it, when you stand up in front of the law, you send for me. I'll walk if I have to. I'll crawl. But I'll be there. And I'll tell them what a soft man stole from a poor old woman who thought it was God testing her." Her voice broke, then steadied again. "It weren't God. Bless you, girl. It weren't God after all." Clara rode home in the gray dawn with her hands empty and her heart pounding, and the sky going pink over the eastern hills, and she made it back to the Bennett farmhouse, and got the mule stabled, and got the false copy. The one meant to be found arranged just carelessly enough in the trunk to look hidden, and got herself into a plain day dress with her hair pinned, and she had just set the kettle on when she heard the horses on the road. More than one. 3, 4. Coming up the marsh road at a walk unhurried, the walk of men who believe the thing they're coming for cannot get away. Clara Bennett stood in the middle of her kitchen and made herself breathe. Her father sat at the table with his coffee, dressed calm, the two of them having agreed on every word they'd say. She'd done all she could. 3 copies in 3 houses. Now it came down to whether a farm girl could stand in front of the law and the whole weight of the Carter name and give nothing away. She'd had practice at that. 10 years of it. The knock, when it came, was the sheriff's official 3 raps. Clara opened the door. Sheriff Dawes stood on the step, a big, slow, decent man she'd known her whole life, and he looked miserable, and behind him sat Josiah Crane on his horse, pink and pleasant, and unable to keep a small, satisfied smile off his soft mouth. And behind Crane on the gray, Clara's heart lurched. William, he'd come. Sitting his horse stiff and pale, a muscle working in his jaw, and beside him, a 4th rider. Clara didn't need to be told the name of, because she'd have known that iron gray gown and that iron still face anywhere. Margaret Carter had come herself. "Morning, Clara," Sheriff Dawes said heavily. "Thomas, I'm well. I'm sorry to say I've got a warrant." He held it up like it pained him. "Sworn complaint from the Carter estate. Says you're in possession of stole papers belonging to the estate, and I'm to search the premises and seize 'em." He wouldn't quite meet her eye. "I got to do it, Clara. You know I got to. It's the law." "I know it, Sheriff." Clara stepped back from the door, calm as still water. "You've a job to do. Come in. There's coffee if you want it. My father and I have nothing to hide from you." She saw Crane's smile flicker at her calm. He'd expected weeping. He'd expected a girl on her knees. He hadn't got one, and it unsettled him. She could see it, and she filed that away because a man who's unsettled makes mistakes. They came in. Dawes and 2 deputies and Crane behind them, and last of all, ducking her iron head under the low farmhouse lintel, she surely thought beneath her Margaret Carter. William stayed in the doorway, and Clara did not look at him, did not dare, because if she looked at him, she might give the whole game away in a glance. "Search where you like," Clara said. "We're plain people. There's not much of us to go through." Crane didn't wait for the deputies. He went straight for the stairs, straight up toward the bedrooms, toward the trunk, and Clara's stomach dropped because how did he know? How did he go straight for it? And then she understood. Cold and clear, he didn't know. He was guessing. A woman hides her treasures where she sleeps. He was just a thief who thought like a thief. She made herself stand still and look worried in exactly the right amount, a woman with a small secret and not a large one. She heard him upstairs, heard the trunk lid bang, heard the rustle, and then, "Here," Crane's voice triumphant greedy. "Sheriff." "Up here?" "It's just as I told the mistress, she's got them. She's got the whole scheme written out. Come and see." He came down the stairs with the false copy in his soft hands, waving it pink face flushed with victory, and he spread it on Clara's own kitchen table in front of the sheriff and Margaret Carter both. "There," he said. "There it is. Estate figures, note balances, family accounts, private estate business stolen and copied out in her own hand. Didn't I tell you, ma'am? Didn't I say she'd been at the books? This is the proof of it. This is the plot laid bare. She seduced your son at the ball to get close enough to steal it, and here it is." And Margaret Carter looked down at the papers on the table, and Clara watched the great lady's cold gray eyes move over the columns and stop. Because Margaret Carter had a head for figures, too. She hadn't held the Carter fortune together for 20 years by being a fool with numbers. And Clara saw the exact moment the older woman's eyes caught on something that didn't fit the story Crane was telling. "Josiah," Margaret said slowly. "What are these 2 columns?" Crane's smile stuttered. "Ma'am, these 2 columns, here, side by side." Her finger, ringed and pale, came down on the page. "This one you say is the note balance, the estate's figure, and this one beside it, smaller, what is this one?" "That's her forgery, ma'am. Her false figure. Part of the scheme to make it look as though the estate overcharged." Margaret Carter's voice had gone very quiet. She was still reading. Her eyes moved down the column and down, and Clara stood frozen and watched the most dangerous woman in the county read the truth off a page that had been meant to be found. "Because that is what this document says, Josiah. It sets your figure beside another figure, and it shows a difference, family by family, and it totals the difference at the bottom, and the total is—" Her voice stopped. The kitchen had gone dead silent. "The total," Margaret Carter said, and for the first time in her life, Clara heard something crack in that iron voice, "is a very great deal of money." "Ma'am, it's a lie. It's her lie. She invented those numbers. Then it should be simple to disprove." Margaret straightened. She turned her gray eyes on Josiah Crane, and there was something terrible waking up behind them. "We'll fetch the original notes from your office, the true contracts, and we'll set them beside this girl's figures, and if she has lied, her lie will show plain, and I'll see her charged for it myself." A pause. "Send for the strongbox, Josiah." And Josiah Crane, pink, soft, pleasant Josiah Crane, went white. Just for an instant. Just for a heartbeat. But Clara saw it, and Margaret Carter saw it, and God help him, the sheriff saw it too. That flash of pure animal panic across a guilty man's face there and gone. The strongbox is a great trouble to move, ma'am," Crane said too fast. "The originals are delicate, old, they oughtn't be handled. Surely my word, as your agent of 20 years, is worth more than a farm girl's scribbling." "My father trusted your word," Margaret Carter said. "For 20 years, as did I." She was looking at him now, the way she'd looked at Clara across the ballroom, weighing, calculating, adding a sum. It would grieve me, Josiah, to find that trust misplaced. So, you'll fetch the strong box, and you'll set my mind at ease, and we'll all of us see the truth of it laid on this table together. Unless, the smallest, coldest pause, there is some reason you would rather we did not. The silence stretched. Everyone in the kitchen felt the floor tilting under something, though not all of them knew yet what. And Josiah Crane, cornered, panicked, 20 years of quiet theft, closing over his head like water, made the mistake Clara had prayed he'd make. He ran. He bolted for the door, shoved past William in the doorway so hard the younger man staggered, and he was out in the yard scrambling for his horse before anyone in the kitchen had drawn breath. And it was the most damning thing a man could possibly have done, because an innocent man does not run. An innocent man stands and demands the strong box be opened to clear his name, and every soul in that kitchen understood it in the same instant. "Stop him!" Margaret Carter said, and it was William who moved. William Carter went out that door like a shot. He caught Josiah Crane with one foot in the stirrup and hauled him back down into the dirt of the Bennett yard, and the soft pink man went sprawling, and William stood over him with his chest heaving and 10 years of being lied to in his eyes. "20 years you worked for my family," William said, and his voice carried back into the house, carried out over the yard, shaking. "You ate at my father's table. You stood at his grave. And all that time you were robbing every poor soul on this road blind and letting them think it was us, letting them hate the name Carter for what you stole in its shadow." He was breathing hard. Get up, Crane. You're going to open that strong box if I have to break your soft hands doing it." Crane lay in the dirt and looked up at the son of the family he'd betrayed, and he did the last cowardly thing left to him. He appealed to the mother, the Keel. "Mrs. Carter," he cried, scrambling backward in the dust. "Ma'am, you know me 20 years, you'd take a farm girl's word. A girl who bewitched your own son over your faithful agent of 20 years. She's clever, ma'am. She's poison. She's turned the boy's head, and now she's turning yours. Don't let her, ma'am. Don't let this ragged little schemer destroy everything your husband built." It was the wrong thing to say. Clara knew it was the wrong thing the moment it left his mouth, because there was one thing on this earth Margaret Carter loved more than her own consequence, and it was the memory of the man she'd buried, and Crane had just laid his lie at that dead man's feet. Margaret Carter came out of the farmhouse into the morning light. She crossed the yard slowly, and she stood over the man groveling in the dirt, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, and it was the most frightening thing Clara had ever heard. "My husband," she said, "built the Carter name on the notion that a man's word was worth more than his fortune. He drilled it into me. He drilled it into his son, though the boy was too young to know it took." Her gray eyes were terrible. "And you have spent 20 years spending that name, my husband's name, on theft from widows. You have made the word Carter a curse on this road. You have made poor men spit when they say it." She drew a breath. "Sheriff Dawes, send 2 men to the estate this hour and secure the east wing. Nothing leaves that office. No papers burn. No strong box opens. No clerk sets foot inside until you yourself are standing over it. And take this man into custody on my complaint, the Carter Estate's complaint for the theft of estate funds and the defrauding of estate tenants." Her voice did not rise. It didn't have to. "I want every note he ever touched examined, every family on this road, and I want it done in the open, where the whole county can watch, so they'll know what was done in our name and know that a Carter was the one who stopped it." Josiah Crane began uselessly to weep, and Clara Bennett stood in the doorway of her father's house and watched 20 years of quiet theft come apart in a farmyard at sunrise, and she felt no triumph. She'd expected triumph. Instead, she felt something heavier and stranger, watching a soft, ruined man led away in irons, watching the sheriff's deputies ride hard for the estate. She felt the enormity of what her pencil had done, sitting alone at a candle-lit table night after night, when nobody in the world thought she was worth talking to. Then Margaret Carter turned around and looked at her, and the morning got very quiet again. The 2 women faced each other across the Bennett yard, the richest woman in Virginia and the poorest girl on the Marsh Road, and everyone else fell still because they understood that whatever had just been settled about Crane, This between these two was not settled at all. You knew, Margaret said. It was not a question. When my son crossed that ballroom, when you told me you weren't for sale, you already knew what Crane was. No, ma'am, Clara said honestly. I didn't. Not then. The night of the ball, I knew only that my figures never matched his, and I thought myself too poor and too ignorant to be right. It was your son who saw it first, who looked at my books and told me the farm girl's arithmetic was the true one and the Carter agent's was the lie. She lifted her chin. So if you're looking for who to be angry at for ruining your faithful agent, ma'am, it wasn't me that bewitched anybody. It was a column of numbers that wouldn't add up the way a thief needed them to. Margaret Carter studied her for a long, long moment. And Clara watched the great lady do the thing she did to everyone, weigh her measure, her add her sum. And Clara stood still and let herself be measured because she'd stopped being afraid of this woman's arithmetic somewhere back in that ballroom. You could have run to a magistrate the moment you had proof, Margaret said. You could have destroyed the Carter name publicly, dragged it through every court in Virginia, made yourself famous as the girl who brought us down. Why didn't you? And here Clara paused, because it was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. Because it wasn't the Carter name that robbed the Hollises, ma'am, she said quietly. It was one man. And your son... She stopped, started again. Your son spent 2 weeks playing the fool in his own house, letting a thief think him harmless, so that I'd have time to gather the proof and Crane wouldn't have time to burn it. That's not the act of a family that steals from widows. That's the act of a man ashamed of what was done in his name and desperate to set it right. Her voice steadied. I don't want to bring the Carters down, Mrs. Carter. I never did. I only ever wanted the Marsh Road to get back what was stole from it. There's a difference. Your husband, by all accounts, knew the difference. I reckoned maybe his widow might too. It was a bold thing to say, perhaps too bold. Clara saw William behind his mother go tense. But Margaret Carter did not strike back. She stood in the poor farmyard in her iron gown, and she looked at Clara Bennett for a long time, and something moved in that cold face. Not warmth, not yet nothing so easy as that. Something more like recognition, the look of a hard woman meeting unexpectedly another hard woman and being forced to revise a sum she'd thought long settled. My son told me you fed him, she said abruptly. In a storm, in April, not knowing who he was. Clara said nothing. He told me that last night, after Crane had poured his poison in my ear and I'd sent for the sheriff. Margaret's jaw tightened. He stood in my room at midnight and he said, Mother, before you do this, know that the woman you mean to destroy is the only person in this valley who ever gave me a thing without first counting what it would fetch. And I did not believe him. Her eyes were steady on Clara's. I thought it was the infatuation talking, a young man bewitched, as Crane said. I sent the sheriff anyway. A long pause. It seems I have made 2 grave misjudgments of character in a single season. One about a man I trusted 20 years, and one about a girl I'd never troubled to speak to. Her mouth twisted, not quite bitter. I do not enjoy being wrong, Miss Bennett. I have had very little practice at it. You'll forgive me if I'm clumsy. It was not an apology. Clara understood that it was as close to one as this woman had come in decades and might ever come, and that it had cost her more to say those few stiff words than it would cost most people to weep on their knees. There's nothing to forgive, ma'am, Clara said. You trusted a man who'd earned your trust and spent it behind your back. That's his sin, not yours. And you came here this morning ready to destroy me, but the moment you saw those 2 columns didn't add up, you stopped. You asked the question. You called for the strongbox. Clara held her eyes. A lesser woman would have burned my papers and never looked at them. You looked. That's the difference between you and Crane, ma'am, and it's not a small one. Something in Margaret Carter's face eased very slightly like a fist, beginning to open. You've a dangerous tongue on you, girl, she said. So I've been told, ma'am, twice this week. And Margaret Carter almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive. But it got close enough that William, watching his mother's face, looked as though the sun had come up twice in one morning. But the thing was not over. Clara knew it wasn't over, and the proof came riding up the marsh road not an hour later, while the deputies were still gone to the estate, and Margaret Carter sat stiff, uneasy, out of place at Thomas Bennett's cracked table, drinking chicory coffee she was plainly unaccustomed to. It was one of the deputies back at a gallop, and his face was wrong. "Mrs. Carter," he panted, half falling off his horse. "Ma'am, you'd best come. The east wing, we secured it like the sheriff said, nothing burned. We were in time, but ma'am, when we went through Crane's strongbox—" He swallowed. "It ain't just the tenant notes. It ain't just the marsh road. Ma'am, there's papers in there. Estate papers." He looked sick. He weren't just robbing the farmers, he's been robbing you, the estate, for years. Skimming the rents, forging your late husband's signature on transfers, moving Carter money into accounts under other names. "Ma'am," the young man's voice dropped. "By what we can see, Josiah Crane has stole more from the Carter family than from every farmer on this road put together. And it goes back further than any of us been alive to remember." The kitchen went utterly silent. Margaret Carter set down her coffee cup very carefully so it wouldn't rattle, and Clara saw that the great lady's hand was for the first time not quite steady. "Forged my husband's signature," Margaret repeated. "On dozens of papers, ma'am. Transfers, sales, things the family never knew happened." And Clara watched the truth land on Margaret Carter. The truth that the man she'd defended for 20 years, the man she'd trusted over her own son, had not only robbed the poor she'd been half willing to see robbed, but had been robbing her, laughing at her, using her dead husband's own name as the instrument of it. And Clara saw the Iron Woman's composure finally fully break. It didn't break into tears. It broke into fury, a cold, towering, magnificent fury that made even the sheriff take a step back. 20 years, Margaret Carter said, rising from the table. "I let that man carry my husband's name into every corner of this county. I let him speak for us. I trusted his figures over my own son's word and over this girl's proof, and I nearly—" She stopped, and her eyes went to Clara, and something raw and unguarded showed in them for one bare instant. "I nearly hanged an honest woman to protect a thief. Because she was poor. Because I looked at a mended glove and a twice-turned hem, and I decided I knew the whole of her." Her voice shook with rage now, all of it turned inward, the worst kind. "I, who prided myself my whole life on being a shrewd judge of worth. I could not see past a girl's empty purse to the sharpest mind on this road. And that soft, smiling devil counted on it. He counted on my contempt for the poor to blind me to his theft. He used my own pride as his cover." She turned to Clara, and for the first time there was nothing cold in her face at all. "You asked me at the ball," Margaret said, "whether a woman without fortune could stand beside a Carter. And I told you no. I told you it in front of the whole county to shame you." She drew a breath. "I was wrong, Miss Bennett. I was wrong in every particular a woman can be wrong. It was not the girl without fortune who couldn't stand beside this family. It was the man with the fat salary and the 20 years of trust. And I never once thought to question him, because he was comfortable, and you were not." Her chin lifted, and there was something almost like grief in it, and something almost like respect. "You will forgive me if it takes me some time to learn to think differently. I am 55 years old, and I have been wrong about a great many things for a very long while. But I should like to begin, if you'll permit me." And Clara Bennett, who had stood at the edge of this woman's ballroom for 10 years, who had been called Poor Clara and Wallflower, and worse, who had been threatened in her own doorway by this woman, not 2 weeks past, looked at Margaret Carter across her father's cracked kitchen table, and understood that she was watching something almost no one ever gets to watch, a proud person in real time choosing to become a better one. "There's coffee left in the pot, ma'am," Clara said gently. "It's poor stuff chicory, not what you're used to. But you're welcome to it. And we can begin over a cup if you like. There's a great deal on this road that needs setting right, and it'll go faster with a Carter's help than without it." Margaret Carter looked at the offered cup. And slowly, stiffly, a woman who had never in her life accepted anything from anyone poorer than herself. She sat back down at the table of the family she'd meant to ruin, and let a farm girl pour her a second cup of chicory coffee. Out in the yard, William Carter stood in the doorway and watched his mother and the woman he had crossed a ballroom for sit down together over a poor man's coffee, and he did not say a word because some things are too large for words, and a man knows better than to break a silence that's doing holy work. But the reckoning wasn't finished, not the true one, because as the sheriff gathered his men to ride for town with Crane in irons, the soft pink man who had been silent, who had been weeping, lifted his head from the back of the wagon and looked at Clara Bennett across the yard with pure venom. All the pleasant scraped off him now, and he said the thing he'd been saving. "You think you've won, girl?" His voice was low, and it carried. "You think you've got your proof. But I've been at this 20 years, and a man doesn't last 20 years without he's got something on everyone, even the dead." His ruined smile came back awful now. "Ask the fine mistress there about her husband's last year of accounts. Ask her what old Mr. Carter signed the winter before he died. Ask her whose idea the whole system was in the first place." His eyes glittered. "I didn't invent robbing the Marsh Road Miss Bennett. I inherited it. I just got greedy and started robbing the family too." He laughed a wet, ugly sound. "Go on. Ask her. Ask her why she never once looked close at my figures in 20 years. Maybe it weren't all trust." And Clara Bennett turned slowly to look at Margaret Carter and saw the great lady's face go the color of ash, and saw her hand freeze around the coffee cup, and saw in those cold gray eyes the unmistakable flicker of a woman who has just heard a door open that she had spent 20 years believing was locked forever. Nobody in the yard moved. The wagon wheels had stopped. Even Sheriff Dawes, halfway to his horse, went still because he'd heard the venom in Crane's voice, and he'd seen Margaret Carter's face go gray, and a lawman learns to feel the ground shift under a thing before he understands it. "Drive on, Sheriff," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, too steady. "The man's a thief and a liar caught in the act, and now he'll say anything to poison the ground behind him. Drive on. Ask her, girl." Crane shrieked from the wagon. "Ask her about the winter of 1814. "I said drive on." Dawes hesitated one more heartbeat, then slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward with Josiah Crane still shouting his words, breaking apart under the wheels and the distance until they were only noise, and then not even that. But the thing was said. It hung in the yard like smoke that wouldn't clear. Clara looked at Margaret Carter, and Margaret Carter looked at the middle distance where the wagon had gone, and William. William stood in the doorway, looking between the two of them with a dawning dread on his face. "Mother," he said, "what was the winter of 1814? Nothing." Margaret set down the coffee cup. Her hand had steadied, or she'd made it steady by force. "The ravings of a cornered man. He's had 20 years to learn where the family's bruises are. He knows which names to say to make us flinch. That's all it was, a thief throwing sand in our eyes as he's carried off. That's not all it was." William came into the yard. He was pale. "I watched your face, Mother. I've watched your face my whole life. You go to stone when you're angry, and you go to ice when you're grieved, and I have never once, not once, seen it do what it did just now. Crane said, ask her whose idea the whole system was, and you went white as death." His voice dropped. "What did my father sign that winter before he died?" Margaret Carter was silent. And Clara Bennett, who had no right to be in the middle of this, who was only a farm girl in whose yard a great family's buried thing had just been dug up. Clara did the kindest and hardest thing she could think of. She turned to go. "This isn't mine to hear," she said quietly. "I'll leave you to your family, ma'am. Whatever it is." "No." Margaret's voice cracked out sharp. "No, stay." She closed her eyes a moment. When she opened them, there was something in her face Clara had never seen there. Not the ice, not the iron. Fear. Plain, human fear. You'll hear it, because you'll find it out anyhow. You've the only honest eyes on those books now, and if you go looking, And you will go looking, it's your nature. I've seen that much, you'll find it inside a month. Better you hear it from me than dig it out of a strongbox and think worse of us than the truth deserves. She drew a long breath, and when she spoke again, it was to her son, though her eyes stayed on the ground. Sit down, William. There's a thing about your father I should have told you 10 years ago. They went inside. Thomas Bennet, sensing the shape of what was coming, gathered himself up on his crutch and made to leave his own kitchen to give them privacy. But Margaret stopped him with a look. "Stay, Mr. Bennet. You've been robbed in my family's name as much as any man on this road. You've earned the right to hear how it started." She sat. She folded her ringed hands on the cracked table, and for a moment the richest woman in Virginia looked in the plain morning light of a poor kitchen simply old. "Your daughter asked me this morning why I never looked close at Crane's figures in 20 years. She meant it as a rebuke. She was right to. But she doesn't know the half of why." Her jaw tightened. "I never looked because I was afraid of what looking would show me. Not about Crane. About my husband." The kitchen held its breath. "The Carter fortune," Margaret said slowly, "was not always what it is. When I married Edward Carter, we were land poor. Great acres, grand name, and debt underneath it all, like rot under a fine floor. Edward's father had gambled and lost, and Edward inherited the losses with the land. We nearly went under twice in the first 5 years of our marriage. Nobody knew. That was the whole art of it. Nobody was ever to know a Carter could fail." Her voice was flat, reciting a thing long rehearsed in private and never once spoken aloud. "Then things turned. The mills came good. The shipping share paid. By the time William was born, we were rising, and by the time he was a boy, we were the richest family in the county, and the story became that we always had been. That's the story William grew up inside. The story I made sure he grew up inside. Mother, let me finish or I'll not get through it." She pressed on. "What I never told you, William, what I've never told a living soul, is how we turned it. Some of it was honest. The mills, the ships, that was Edward's cleverness, real and earned. But some of it—" She stopped. Started again, harder. "The winter of 1814. We were close again to going under a bad season. Ships lost a note called we couldn't meet. And a young clerk your father had just taken on, a soft, clever, pleasant young man named Josiah Crane, came to Edward with a scheme. The tenant notes. The mortgages on the Marsh Road and the Valley Farms. Crane showed him how the interest could be adjusted. Compounded where the contract said simple. A little on each note. Nothing any one family would notice or dare question. Spread across 50 families, it would be enough to meet the called note and save the estate." Her hands had gone white at the knuckles. "And Edward Carter?" "My Edward, who drilled into me and into you that a man's word is worth more than his fortune." Edward said yes. The silence in the kitchen was total. He told himself it was temporary. Margaret went on, and her voice had gone very quiet. "Just to weather the winter. Just till the ships came back. He told himself he'd set it right after, pay it all back quiet as it was taken, and perhaps he even meant to. But the ships came back and the money was good, and it was so easy and so quiet, and no one ever noticed, and the temporary thing became the permanent thing, the way they do. By the time Edward understood he'd never set it right, it had been running 6 years, and to undo it would have been to confess it, and a Carter does not confess." Her mouth twisted with old bitterness. "So it ran. And when Edward died, he left the whole machine to Crane to keep, and Crane kept it, and I—" She looked up at last and met her son's eyes, and there were no tears in her own, only something worse, a dry old grief long past the ease of weeping. "I knew, William, not the whole of it, but I knew the fortune had a stain on it. I knew there was something in the tenant accounts your father never wanted looked at close, and I chose for 20 years not to look, because looking would have meant knowing my husband for a thief, and I could not bear it. I loved him. God forgive me, I loved him, and I let a whole road stay robbed, rather than learn the worst of a dead man I loved." Busan. William Carter sat at the cracked table with his face in his hands. "So it was ours. he said, muffled broken. It was never just Crane. The whole thing that beggared this road, the Hollis's horse, the Pruitt widow's egg money, all of it, it started with my father. With us. Crane only inherited it and got greedy. Crane got greedy, Margaret said. He took your father's temporary sin and made it his permanent living, and then he grew bold and began robbing us too, on top of the farmers, and that greed is his own, and he'll hang for it, if there's justice. But the root of it, she could barely say it. The root of it was Edward, and me. Me most of all for knowing and looking away. Crane at least had the excuse of a thief's nature. I had no excuse but cowardice and love, and I'm not sure at the last that those are so very different from a thief's nature after all. For a long moment no one spoke. The old clock ticked. A fly worried at the window. And then Clara Bennett, who had listened to the whole of it in silence. This confession that turned her simple story of a good family and a bad agent into something far darker and far more human. Clara did the thing that decided everything that came after. She reached across the table and took Margaret Carter's cold, ringed hand in her own work-roughened one. "Ma'am," she said, "look at me." Margaret looked. "You just did the one thing your husband couldn't, and Crane never would." Clara's voice was steady and gentle and absolutely certain. "You looked. You told the truth out loud in front of your son and 2 witnesses, knowing it cost you the memory of the man you loved, and maybe the name you spent your life protecting. Your husband couldn't confess. You just did." She tightened her grip. "That's not cowardice, Mrs. Carter. That's the bravest thing I've watched anybody do, and I've watched some brave things these 2 weeks. A coward would have let Crane hang alone and buried the rest with him. You could have. Nobody would ever have known. Crane's a caught thief. Who'd believe his ravings about a dead man? You could have driven that wagon off and let the whole stain go to the grave with him, and kept your husband a saint and yourself clean." She leaned in. "You didn't. Why didn't you?" Margaret Carter looked at the farm girl holding her hand, and something in her face finally broke all the way open. "Because you fed my son in a storm and took no coin for it," she whispered. "Because I have spent this morning watching a girl I called worthless prove herself the only honest soul in this whole county. And I found I could not sit at your table and take your coffee and let you go on thinking the theft was all one soft man's doing when the truth is my family built the road you've bled on." Her voice shook. "You gave without counting the cost. I have counted the cost of everything my whole life. I have never once given a thing freely, not to my son, not to my husband, not to God." A tear finally came, one tracking down the iron face. "I am 55 years old, and this morning, in a poor kitchen, a girl in mended gloves taught me the thing my whole fortune never could. I did not want to die the way I'd lived. That's why." And Margaret Carter, who had come to that house at dawn to see Clara Bennett hanged, put her other hand over Clara's, and the 2 women sat holding hands across the cracked table, while William Carter wept quietly into his own, and old Thomas Bennett looked on with an expression of such wonder that it was as though he were watching the sunrise in the west. But there was still the matter of what to do. It was William who lifted his head first, and when he did, his face had changed. The grief was still there, but under it something had hardened into resolve. "Then we said it right," he said. "All of it. Not just Crane's greed, the whole of it. Everything my father took, and everything Crane took on top of it. Every dollar. We pay the Marsh Road back to the last penny, with the honest interest they should have paid subtracted out, so that every family on this road ends up not robbed, but made whole." He looked at his mother. "It'll cost a fortune, Mother. It might cost us the fortune. 20 years of theft, paid back to 50 families. It could take the mills, the ships, the estate itself maybe. Then it takes them," Margaret Carter said. William stared at her. "You heard me. Then it takes them." She wiped the single tear away with the back of her hand, brisk, almost angry at it. "What is the Carter fortune, William? Ask yourself plain. It is a great pile of money that sits on the broken backs of the Marsh Road. Your grandfather gambled the honest part away, and your father stole the rest, and I guarded the theft for 20 years and called it legacy. That's not a legacy. That's a debt. Her chin came up, and for a moment, she was every inch the Iron Woman again. Only the iron was pointed the right way now. So we pay it. If paying every family what we owe them honest and full beggars us, then we'll be beggared honestly. And that's more than any Carter's been in 3 generations. I would rather your father's grandchildren inherit a clean name and an empty purse than a full one built on the Pruitt widow's eggs. She looked at her son hard. Your father couldn't confess because he couldn't bear to be poor again. He'd taste it going under, and he'd sooner rob a road than taste it twice. Well, I've made my peace with the taste. Let it come. I'd sooner be poor and able to say the name Carter out loud in a church than rich and having to whisper it. A grim ghost of a smile. Besides, I hear tell there's a girl on this road can make a farm survive 2 years past when it should have died on nothing but her wits and a candle. If the worst comes, perhaps she'll teach me how the poor manage. I've clearly a great deal to learn. Clara let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something that stung her eyes. It won't come to that, ma'am, she said. Beggaring, I mean. You can't know that. I can, actually. Clara pulled the ledgers toward her, her own ledgers, the ones she'd built by candlelight, and opened them, and there was a light in her eyes now that both Carters were coming to recognize the light of a mind that has seen a way through where others see only a wall. Because I've spent 2 weeks living inside these numbers, and I know them better than any lawyer you could hire. You're thinking of this like a confession that has to bankrupt you to be sincere. That's guilt talking, ma'am, and guilt's a poor bookkeeper. Her pencil was already moving. Here's the truth of the figures. What was stolen from the Marsh Road is a great deal to 50 poor families, but to the Carter estate, to the mills and the ships and the 5,000 acres, it's a wound, not a death. Paid back over 3 years, instead of demanded all at once, structured against the mill income offset by what you'll recover from Crane's hidden accounts because he stole from you too, remember, and that money can be clawed back. She looked up. You can make every family on this road whole and keep the estate standing. Not rich as you were, but standing. Honest and standing. It's not a choice between confession and ruin, ma'am. That's a false sum. There's a third column, and it's the one I'm best at, the one where you do the right thing and survive it. You just need someone who can do the arithmetic. Margaret Carter looked down at the flying pencil, at the columns taking shape, at the way this girl turned an impossible moral catastrophe into a solvable problem in figures, and the great lady began slowly to laugh. It was a rusty sound. It clearly hadn't been used in years, but it was real. Dear God, Margaret said, you really are the most dangerous person in this county. Edward would have hired you in a heartbeat and never slept easy again. She shook her head, wondering. You're offering to save the family that beggared your road, to do the books that keep the Carters standing. After everything I'm offering to make the Marsh Road whole, Clara corrected gently, in the only way that actually works, which happens to leave your family standing as a side effect. Don't mistake me for soft-hearted, ma'am. If ruining you was the only way to pay back the Pruitt widow, I'd ruin you and sleep sound. But it isn't. And a ruined Carter estate pays nobody back, it just makes 50 more poor families and calls it justice. Justice that starves people isn't justice. It's just revenge wearing justice's coat. She held Margaret's eyes. I want the widow's egg money back in her hands. I want Eli Hollis's boy to marry his Tanner girl. I want this road to stop hating a name that one honest woman is trying to clean. If I can get all that and keep your mills running so there's still work on this road come winter, then that's the sum I'll solve for. It's a better answer than ashes. And Margaret Carter, looking at Clara Bennett across the cracked table, said the thing that changed the shape of both their lives. Come work for the estate, she said. Clara went still. I mean it. Not charity. I'll not insult you with charity. You'd throw it in my face, and rightly. Work. Real wages. Margaret's eyes were sharp now, alive, the merchant's daughter she'd buried under 20 years of iron surfacing at last. Crane's post is empty and it's poisoned, and it needs a soul honest enough to clean it and hard enough not to be corrupted by it. You're the only person alive who's proven both. You caught what 20 years of trained men missed. You built the case that toppled him out of pencil and candlelight. You could run those books better than any man I could hire from Richmond, and you'd never once cheat a widow because you've been the widow near enough." She leaned in. "Manage the estate's accounts, Miss Bennet. Set right what my family broke. Restructure the debts, oversee the repayments. Keep the mills honest and running. I'll pay you what I'd pay any man for the work more, because you're worth more, and you'll have the one thing this county's denied you your whole life, which is a place where your worth is measured by what you can do and not by what your father can't." The kitchen was silent. Thomas Bennet was staring at his daughter. William was staring at his mother at this transformation, at the woman who 2 weeks ago had told this same girl she was unfit to stand beside a carter, now offering to hand her the family's entire fortune to manage. And Clara Bennet. Clara, who had kept books for 6 families in exchange for cornmeal and the loan of a mule. Clara, who had been called poor and pitied and overlooked for 10 long years. Clara, who had never in her life been offered a thing that acknowledged she was clever rather than merely enduring. Clara found she could not immediately speak. "Ma'am," she managed at last, "you understand what you're offering. You're offering to hand the poorest girl on the Marsh Road the keys to the Carter fortune. 2 weeks ago, you thought me a schemer who bewitched your son to steal your books. Now you'd have me keep them. 2 weeks ago, I was a fool who'd been one for 20 years. Margaret said flatly. "I've stopped. It's expensive stopping being a fool. It costs you everything you thought you knew, but I find I can afford it just barely, and I mean to spend it well. Yes, Miss Bennet, I understand exactly what I'm offering. I'm offering it because you're the only person in Virginia I'd trust with it. Do you imagine that's easy for me to say to a girl in mended gloves? It is not. It is the hardest thing I've said in my life, except the confession I just made. But it's true, and I've decided to start saying true things whatever they cost me." Her mouth quirked. "You did teach me that this morning. Don't make me regret the lesson." And slowly, Clara Bennet began to smile. "I'll want it in writing," she said. "The wages, the post, my authority over the books plain, so no cousin of yours can come along and countermand me because I'm a woman and poor. And the first thing I do, the very first before I so much as touch a mill account, is the Marsh Road. Every family made whole poorest first. The Pruitt widow gets her egg money back before the estate buys a single new thing. Those are my terms, ma'am, and they're not for bargaining." "Done," said Margaret Carter. "And in writing." "In writing, drawn up by a lawyer of your choosing, not mine." Margaret extended her hand across the cracked table, the same hand that had pointed at Clara in the ballroom, the same hand that had signed the warrant to search this house at dawn. "Have we a bargain, Miss Bennet?" Clara looked at the offered hand. Palm up. Open. An offering, not a command, the exact way the son had offered his hand across a ballroom 2 weeks and a lifetime ago. She put her mended glove into it. "We've a bargain, Mrs. Carter." They shook, the two of them, iron and pencil fortune and wits across the table, where an old man's failing accounts had first revealed a thief, and William Carter watched them do it, and understood that the world he'd been born into had just quietly in a poor kitchen come to an end, and something better had been born in its place. The weeks that followed were the strangest and the fullest of Clara's life. Word got out, of course. It couldn't not. Within days, the whole county knew that Josiah Crane sat in the county jail awaiting trial for the theft of estate funds and the defrauding of 50 tenant families, and that the girl who'd caught him, the Wallflower William Carter, had danced with the pauper's daughter, the widow Ashford had pitied at the ball, was now keeping the Carter books herself at a man's wages by the old mistress's own hand. The parlors did not know what to do with it. The story wouldn't fit the shape they'd built for Clara Bennet. Poor Clara was supposed to stay poor and pitiable, a cautionary tale, a wall to lean the county's cruelty against. She was not supposed to become the most quietly powerful figure on the Marsh Road inside a single summer. Prudence Vale, who had murmured poor Clara at the ball, now found that every invitation she sent to the Carter estate had to pass somehow, near the desk of the woman she'd mocked, and the discovery gave her a permanent expression. Folks said like she'd bit a lemon, she'd expected to be a peach. But Clara had no time for the parlors. She was too busy doing the thing she was born for and had never once been allowed to do. She went family to family down the marsh road, the same families, the same kitchen tables. But this time she came not to copy figures in fear, but to hand them back what was stolen. She sat across from Eli Hollis and slid a paper across the table and watched the big gentle man read the sum the estate owed him. Back honest interest subtracted, and watched him put his one good hand over his mouth and weep for the second time in a month, this time for a different reason entirely. "My boy," Eli said when he could speak. "The Tanner girl. We can... Clara, this is enough that we can marry them in the fall, Eli," Clara said gently, "with the estate's blessing and my own. And buy a new plow horse besides. A good one, better than the one he stole." She sat with Widow Pruitt in the old woman's cold cottage and counted into her thin, bird-boned hands the full sum Crane had squeezed out of her for a debt 3 years dead. Every dollar, every egg's worth, back where it belonged. And the old woman held the money and the returned Bible both against her chest and rocked and said only over and over, "It weren't God. It weren't God after all. Bless the girl. It weren't God," until Clara had to go and sit in the trap outside for a while before she could drive on, because there are some kinds of gladness that hurt worse than grief. And Margaret Carter. This was the part that astonished the county. Most of all, Margaret Carter came with her some days. The iron mistress who had not set foot in a tenant's kitchen in 30 years, rode out beside the pauper girl she'd hired and sat at cracked tables and looked poor families in the eye, and did a thing no Carter had ever done, which was to say plainly in her own hard voice, "My family wronged you. I knew, and I looked away. I'm sorry for it, and here is what's owed you, and it will not happen again while I draw breath." It did not make her beloved. 20 years of a family's theft doesn't wash off in a season, and there were those on the Marsh Road who took the Carter money with a hard eye and no thanks, and Margaret let them, and said they'd every right. But it changed the name. Slowly, kitchen by kitchen, repayment by repayment, the word Carter stopped being a curse. Folks spat and started being, if not yet blessed, at least no longer poison. And the woman most responsible for that, everyone knew it, though the parlors hated to say it was the girl in the mended gloves. As for William was there through all of it, and yet he held himself back, and Clara understood why, and loved him the more for it, though she'd not yet let herself say so even inside her own head. Because it would have been the easiest thing in the world now for William Carter to cross a room and claim her. The obstacle was gone. His mother, who'd stood between them at the ball, now all but blessed the match with every glance. Clara was no longer the pauper he'd shame himself to court. She was the estate's own woman of business, respected essential, drawing a wage. Every reason they'd had to keep apart had dissolved in a single summer. And that precisely was the problem, and William, to his enormous credit, saw it before Clara had to explain it. He came to her one evening as she was closing the estate books, and he stood in the doorway of the office that had been Crane's and was now hers. And he turned his hat in his hands, the way he had on her father's step that first morning. "I want to say a thing to you," he said, "and then I want to not say it again for a good long while, and I want you to understand why." Clara set down her pen. "Say it then." "I love you." He said it plainly, steadily, a man stating a fact he'd carried a long time. "I've loved you since a wet night in April when a farm girl scolded me for being ashamed to eat her supper. I loved you across that ballroom before I ever had the courage to cross it. I love you now keeping my family's books better than my family ever kept them, making a whole road hole." He drew a breath. "And I'll not ask you for a thing on the strength of it. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while." Clara's heart was going hard. "Why not?" "Because think how it would look." His jaw tightened. "Think how it would feel. If I claimed you now this summer with the whole county watching, then forever after the story of Clara Bennett would be the story of the pauper girl who caught the Carter heir. That's the shape they'd force you back into. Not the woman who toppled a 20-year fraud out of pencil and candlelight. Not the mind that saved 50 families and kept an estate standing. Just the girl who married up. They'd take everything you built and reduce it to a wedding." He shook his head fierce. I won't let them do that to you. You spent 10 years being made small. I'll not be the man who makes you small again by loving you at the wrong moment." He put his hat back on. "So I'll wait. I'll wait until the whole county knows Clara Bennett for what she is on her own account, until your name means the woman who cleaned the marsh road and not the girl a Carter chose. And then, when no one could ever mistake you for something I lifted up instead of something that stood up on its own. Then, Miss Bennett, I'll cross a room for you again. And I'll ask you properly. And you can answer however you like, and it'll be a true answer, because by then you'll have every reason to say no and every freedom to say it." Clara Bennett sat in the office that had been a thief's and was now hers, and looked at the man who loved her enough to not marry her yet, and understood that she'd been wrong that terrible first night when she'd told him promises made in barns don't survive the walk to the big house. Some did. This one had. It had survived the barn and the ballroom and the sheriff at dawn and a dead man's buried sin. And it was standing in her doorway, turning its hat in its hands, refusing to be spoken so that she could be free. "William Carter," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "That is the second cleverest thing anyone said in this whole affair." "Second." A ghost of a smile. "What's the first?" "A body doesn't ask a hungry man for his pedigree before it feeds him." She smiled, and it wobbled, and she let it. "I'll hold you to your waiting, sir. Every day of it. And when you've waited long enough when you cross that room." She picked her pen back up because there were still books to close and a road to make whole, and she was after everything a woman with work to do. "You'd best ask properly like you said, because I've discovered I've a dangerous tongue, and I'll not make it easy on you." "I'd be disappointed if you did," said William Carter, and tipped his hat and left her to her work. And Clara Bennett bent back over the estate books in the last of the evening light in the office that a summer ago she'd never have been permitted to enter, doing the honest arithmetic that was setting a whole road right, and she found that she was, for the first time in 10 long years, exactly where she belonged, and worth exactly what she'd always been worth, and that the only person who'd ever needed convincing of it in the end had been herself. The waiting turned out to be longer than either of them expected, and it was Josiah Crane who stretched it out, Crane from his cell, who was not finished doing damage even in irons. The trial came in the autumn, and it did not go the simple way the county wanted it to. Clara had built her case to be unbreakable, and against Crane's theft it was. Family by family, note by note, his own figures against his own contracts. The arithmetic hanging him. But Crane had a lawyer now, a sharp, thin man up from Richmond that somebody had paid for. And Clara had a bad feeling about who, and the bad feeling proved right, and that lawyer had understood at once that his client couldn't beat the numbers. So he'd made a different plan. He couldn't save Crane. He meant instead to take the Carters down with him. "Isn't it true?" the thin lawyer asked on the second day with Margaret Carter sitting straight-backed in the gallery. "That this so-called fraud began not with my client, but with the late Edward Carter himself. That my client merely continued a scheme of interest padding, designed and ordered by the head of the very family, now painting him the villain." The courtroom stirred. Margaret did not move. "Isn't it true," the lawyer pressed, "that the present mistress of the Carter estate knew of this scheme for 20 years and profited from it in silence? That the Carters are not the wronged party here at all, but the architects of the whole theft, throwing my client to the wolves to save their own name?" Nah, he was good. Clara had to give him that. He'd found the true bruise, and he pressed it in front of God and the county, and the whispers ran through the courtroom like fire through dry grass, and Clara saw the case she'd built, the clean story of a good family and a bad agent, begin to come apart in real time. And that was when Margaret Carter stood up. She stood up in the gallery, uninvited, unbidden, an old woman in an iron-gray gown, and the courtroom went silent because the mistress of the Carter estate did not stand up in courtrooms. "Your Honor," she said, "may I speak?" The judge, flustered, half rose. "Mrs. Carter, this is most irregular. You're not called to—" "I'm aware it's irregular. So is a family confessing its own theft. I'll be brief." She did not wait for permission. She never had, not really. "The lawyer is right. The word dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Clara's heart stopped. William beside her went rigid. "My husband began this." Margaret Carter said, her voice carrying to every corner, flat and clear and merciless with herself. In the winter of 1814, to save an estate near ruin, Edward Carter took Josiah Crane's counsel and began padding the interest on the tenant notes of this valley. A little on each. Enough to save us. He told himself it was temporary. It was not. And I knew not the whole, but enough to know the fortune had a stain on it, and I chose for 20 years not to look, because looking meant knowing my husband a thief, and I loved him, and I was a coward. She let that sit. So yes, the root of this theft is Carter. The lawyer speaks true, and I'll not have this court told otherwise, not even to convict a guilty man. My family began it. The courtroom was in an uproar. The judge banged for order. Crane in the dock was actually smiling, the ruined smile of a man who's pulled the temple down on everyone. And then Margaret Carter said the thing that turned it all. "But here is what the lawyer will not tell you," she said, and now her voice sharpened the merchant's daughter and the iron mistress both at once. "My husband began the theft. His client continued it. But somewhere in those 20 years, Josiah Crane stopped merely continuing my family's sin and began adding his own on top of it, robbing the estate itself, forging my dead husband's signature, moving Carter money into accounts under false names. He stole from the poor in my family's name, and then he stole from my family besides, and thought us all too proud or too foolish to ever look." Her gray eyes found Crane in the dock, and they were terrible. "So let this court be clear on the sum of it. The Carters owe the Marsh Road a debt, and the Carters are paying it every dollar poorest first by our own hand, and our own free choice begun months before this trial, as 50 families in this valley will swear. We do not throw this man to the wolves to save our name. We threw ourselves to the wolves first. We confessed our own part before he could accuse us of it, and we began the repayment before any court ordered it. That is the difference between us and him, Your Honor. Not that we are clean, we are not, but that when we were shown the stain, we chose to wash it at great cost in the open. And he shown the same stain, chose only to deepen it, and to hide, and now to try to drown a whole valley's justice in it, rather than answer for the part that is his alone." She drew herself up. "Convict him for what is his, the forgery, the theft from the estate, the greed he added to an inheritance of sin. And convict my dead husband too in your hearts, and me with him, we've earned it. But do not let this thin man from Richmond tell you that because the Carters began a wrong, the Carters cannot be the ones to end it. Because we are ending it. It is the only thing my family has done right in 20 years, and I will not let a lawyer's cleverness rob us of the one clean act we have left." She sat down. The courtroom was silent. And into that silence, slowly from the back, an old woman rose. Widow Pruitt in her best black, clutching her dead husband's Bible. And she said in a thin, quavering voice that somehow reached every ear, "She give me back my egg money. The Carter woman did. Come to my own cold kitchen and put it in my hands and said sorry to my face. 20 years I thought God was punishing me, and it were that man, a shaking finger at Crane, and it were the Carter woman that made it right months back afore any of you thought to hold a trial." Her chin trembled. "I don't know much of law, but I know who come to my kitchen and who didn't, and she come." Then Eli Hollis stood. "She made my family whole, honest to the penny. My boys marrying this fall on money that soft devil stole." He looked at Crane with pure contempt. "Convict him, and leave the Carters be. They're the ones fixed it." One by one, up and down the gallery, the Marsh Road stood up. Family after family, the robbed and the wronged, rising to say the same thing in their own plain words. She came, they paid. It's mended, convict him, and let them be. The very people Crane had counted on to hate the Carter name stood up in a courtroom and defended it, not because the name was clean, but because the family had done the one thing Crane never would, which was to face what it had done and pay for it in the open. And the thin lawyer from Richmond, watching his whole strategy collapse under the weight of 50 poor witnesses, sat down and said no more. Josiah Crane was convicted on every count: the forgery, the theft from the estate, the defrauding of the tenants. The judge in his sentencing made a point of noting for the record that while the origin of the tenant scheme lay with the late Edward Carter, a matter for God's court, now not his, the present Carter estate had confessed its part unbidden and made full restitution unforced, and that this weighed heavily and rightly in the county's judgment of the living. Crane went to prison. His sharp lawyer went back to Richmond. Unpaid for it, came out soon after that, it was Crane's own hidden money that had bought him stolen money, and the court clawed even that back for the Marsh Road. And Clara Bennett, who had built the case that did it, sat in the courtroom and watched the county she'd been invisible in for 10 years rise to its feet in defense of a truth she had dug out of a candlelit ledger, and understood that she had not just caught a thief. She had changed what the name Carter meant, and what the name Bennett meant, and what a poor girl with a good mind was worth, all in a single turning year. The years that came after were good ones, and they were hers. The estate did not fall. Clara's arithmetic held as it always held. The repayment ran 3 years and cost the Carters dear. The second of the 2 ships was sold, and a parcel of the far acres, and Margaret Carter lived more plainly at 58 than she had at any point since her wedding, and pronounced herself the better for it. "I sleep," she told Clara once dryly, going over the books together of an evening. "First time in 20 years. Turns out, a clean ledger's a finer sleeping draught than any the apothecary sells. Who'd have thought?" But the mills ran, and the mills ran honest now. And the road that had once spat the name Carter came over those 3 years, to say it plain again, and then slower, harder. One, but real to say it with a kind of grudging warmth, because the Carters had done the thing almost no one with money ever does, which was to give a great deal of it back to people who could never have forced them to. And at the center of all of it, quiet and essential, and impossible to overlook, was Clara. She built the thing that outlasted the scandal. Within 2 years, the estate's account room was the most respected in 3 counties, and it was known, everyone knew it, that a woman ran it, a woman who'd once been the Wallflower of the Carter Ball, and that she ran it better than any man in Richmond. Families outside the Marsh Road began to bring her their books. Merchants asked her counsel. When the new bank opened in the county town, its founders came hats in hand to ask Miss Bennett's opinion on their terms before they printed them, and she gave it, and it was sound, and they took it. The same parlors that had murmured "poor Clara" now found they could not hold an assembly of any consequence without her, because to be at odds with the woman who kept the county's accounts was to be a fool in business as well as manners. Prudence Vale, who had pitied her at the ball, came one autumn to ask, stiffly choking on it, whether Miss Bennett might look at the Vale family's tangled affairs, the Vales having fallen on hard times themselves. And Clara, who could have savored that, who had earned the right to savor it, did not. "Sit down, Prudence," she said not unkindly, and pulled a chair. "Let's see what can be done. A body doesn't ask for a pedigree before it helps. Bring me your papers." She'd learned that from her mother, and she'd taught it without meaning to an iron woman in a poor kitchen, and now it had come all the way round again. Thomas Bennett lived to see it. That was the mercy Clara was most grateful for all her days. He lived to see his failing farm not fail, to see the mortgage Margaret Carter had once threatened him with torn up entirely forgiven, as part of the road's repayment, the deed put clean in his daughter's name. He lived to see the Bennett house made sound, the roof that had leaked on a fevered stranger mended at last, the fields worked by hired hands, his daughter's wages paid for. He sat on his own sound porch in the evenings, his bad leg propped, and watched the trap come up the Marsh Road, bringing his girl home from the estate, and he'd say to Silas near every evening the same thing: "There she comes, my Clara, sharpest mind in the county, and I raised her on cornbread and candlelight." And his voice would crack a little every time. They none of them could see her. 10 years not one of them could see her. And she was there the whole while. She was there the whole while, Silas just waiting on a single soul to look. And William Carter, William kept his word. That was the thing Clara held to through all of it. In the long stretch of the waiting, he kept his word exactly as he'd sworn it in the doorway of her office. He did not cross the room. Not through the trial when it would have looked like a family closing ranks. Not through the first year of repayments when it would have looked like a reward. Not through the second when Clara's name was rising, but not yet risen. He waited present, always steady, always, at every estate meeting and every account closing and every hard-won kitchen reconciliation. His eyes finding hers across 100 rooms and saying the thing his mouth had promised not to say yet. And he waited until no living soul in Virginia could have called Clara Bennett anything but exactly what she was on her own account, in her own name, by her own hand. It was 3 years to the summer. The estate held its first ball since the scandal, a real one. The old midsummer ball, the same the Carters had thrown the night William crossed the floor for a Wallflower. Margaret had resisted it at first. "It feels like the old life," she'd said. "The life I'm glad to be shut of." "It's not the old life," Clara had told her. The old life had a thief keeping the books and a wall full of women nobody would dance with. This one's got neither. Throw the ball, ma'am. Let the road see the house it's mended. Let them dance in it. So the ball was thrown. And the Marsh Road came not as tenants, not as the robbed, but as guests, Eli Hollis in his good coat, with his new daughter-in-law on his arm, the Tanner girl that money had once kept from him, married now and glowing. Widow Pruitt came in her best black and sat in a place of honor and told anyone who'd listen the story of the girl who'd proved it weren't God after all. The whole valley filled the Carter ballroom, the grand room where Clara Bennett had stood invisible against the wall for 10 summers, holding a warm glass of lemonade she never drank. And Clara stood in that same room, not against the wall now, but at the heart of it, because there was no assembly in that county that revolved anywhere but around her anymore, and she was talking accounts with a merchant the way she always was when the music changed and the room began, without quite seeming to go quiet. She knew the quiet. She'd heard it once before, 3 years and a lifetime ago. She turned. William Carter was crossing the floor. He crossed it the way he'd crossed it the first time, with a certainty that asked no one's permission. His eyes on her, and only her, the whole grand room narrowing to the sound of one man's boots on polished wood. But it was not the same, and everyone in that room knew it was not the same, and that was the whole point of it. The thing he'd waited 3 years to make true. The first time 40 faces had turned to watch the richest man in Virginia stoop to a wallflower nobody had chosen. This time, 40 faces turned to watch a man cross a room to a woman the whole county had come to reckon its equal, its better in the things that counted, and the silence was not the shocked silence of before, but something hushed and glad. The silence of a room that has waited 3 years for exactly this and can hardly believe it's finally come. He stopped in front of her. He took off his hat. "Miss Bennett," he said, and his voice low and steady and meant for her, carried in the quiet all the same. "3 years ago, I told you I'd wait. I'd wait until no soul in Virginia could mistake you for something I lifted up, until your name meant the woman who cleaned the Marsh Road and caught a 20-year thief and kept a fool family standing, and not the girl a Carter chose." He drew a breath. "I've waited, and I've watched this whole county come to know you for exactly what you are. There's not a merchant in 3 counties won't take your counsel. There's not a family on this road you haven't made whole. There's not a person in this room tonight who dare call you anything but the finest mind and the truest heart in Virginia. You built that, on your own. I never lifted a finger of it. God knows I only ever tried to keep out of your way." His jaw worked. "So there's no one left who could mistake you now. And I find I've kept my word long enough, and I'm done waiting. And I've come to ask you the thing I've wanted to ask you since a wet night in April 4 years past." He held out his hand, palm up, open, an offering, not a command. "Clara Bennett," said William Carter in front of the whole valley in the ballroom where she'd once stood invisible. "Will you marry me?" And Clara Bennett looked at that open hand and then at his face, and then she couldn't help it out past his shoulder to where Margaret Carter sat among the matrons at the head of the room. The same place. The exact same place the Iron Woman had sat 3 years ago and weighed a wallflower and found her wanting. Margaret Carter was watching now as she'd watched then, but her face had done a thing it had not known how to do 3 years ago. It was smiling openly, unguardedly, the whole cold iron gone out of it. And when she caught Clara's eye across the room, the great lady who had once told this girl she was unfit to stand beside a Carter did a small extraordinary thing. She nodded, and she mouthed two words plain enough for Clara to read across the whole length of that grand room: "Say yes." Clara's eyes stung. She looked back at William. "You know," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, and she let it not be, "when you crossed this floor the first time I asked if it was a wager. I asked if one of your friends had bet you couldn't dance with the Wallflower." A wet, unsteady laugh. "I spent that whole first dance certain you'd deliver me back to this wall and be done. I'd braced for it. I'd braced my whole life for the moment the good thing turned out to be a joke at my expense." "It was never a joke," William said quietly. "No." Clara's voice broke and steadied. "No, it wasn't. It took me a long while to believe that. 10 years being made small teaches you that every offered hand is a trap." She looked at the open hand between them. "But you never once closed it on me, William Carter. Not that first night. Not in 3 years of waiting. You held it open, and you let me be the one to reach every single time, so that whatever I chose would be mine, and not something done to me." Her eyes came up to his brimming. "That's the whole of what I ever wanted. Not to be rescued, not to be chosen. Just to be the one who gets to choose." "Then choose," William said, low, certain, his hands steady between them. "However you like. You've every reason to say no and every freedom to say it. I built you that freedom on purpose. Use it any way you please." And Clara Bennett, in the ballroom where she had stood invisible for 10 long summers, in front of the whole valley she had made whole with the freedom she had won for herself by her own hand and her own mind. Clara Bennett reached out and put her hand into his. Not a mended glove this time. Bare. Her own bare hand, work roughened and strong, and entirely her own, closing over his of her own free choosing. "Yes," she said. The ballroom broke into sound like a dam giving way, but it was a different sound than 3 years before. Not the scandalized gasp of a room watching the impossible, but a great glad roar of a whole valley that had waited and hoped and could finally cheer. Eli Hollis was shouting. Widow Pruitt was weeping into her Bible and laughing at the same time. The marsh road, every soul of it, the robbed and the mended and the made whole, filled that grand room with a joy that shook the crystal, because the girl they'd once pitied against the wall had won all of it on her own terms, in her own name, and they had lived to stand in a ballroom and watch her do it. And Margaret Carter crossed the floor herself. Then the Iron Mistress, 3 years humbler and a whole soul richer, and she did not take Clara's hand. She took Clara in her arms, held her stiff and unpracticed and utterly sincere, the way a woman holds something she nearly threw away, and got by grace she didn't deserve a second chance to keep. "I told you once," Margaret said into her ear low, so only Clara could hear it over the roar, "that a woman without fortune couldn't stand beside a Carter." She pulled back, and her gray eyes were wet, and her voice was fierce with everything she'd learned too late, and was so grateful to have learned it all. "I was wrong, child. It was never you who couldn't stand beside us. It was we who spent 20 years unworthy to stand beside you. And I thank God, I thank Him every night that you were patient enough with a foolish old woman to let her live long enough to see it and say it and be glad." They were married that autumn in the plain church on the Marsh Road, not the grand one in town. The whole valley came. Thomas Bennett walked his daughter down the aisle on his bad leg upright the whole way by pure will, and cried the entire time and did not care who saw. Widow Pruitt read the scripture. Eli Hollis's boy and his Tanner bride stood up as witnesses. And when the parson asked who gave this woman old Thomas Bennett, said in a voice that carried to the rafters, "Nobody gives her. She was never anybody's to give. She's giving herself, and God help the man, he's the luckiest in Virginia." And the whole church laughed and wept at once. Clara Carter kept the estate books to the end of her long life, and kept them honest, and the Marsh Road never again knew a thief in a warm office. because the woman who watched over it had once been poor enough to know exactly what a stolen dime cost a family, and sharp enough to catch it and hard enough to stop it. She and William built the estate back, not to what it had been, the false, gilded thing on the road's broken back, but to something better and cleaner and real. An estate that paid honest wages and kept honest books and gave without first counting the cost. They had children, and their children grew up being told, every one of them, at every knee, the story of the wet night in April and the ballroom and the candle-lit ledger that caught a 20-year thief. Their children grew up knowing that the family fortune had once been stained and had been cleaned, and that the woman who cleaned it had come to the house in mended gloves that a whole county had sneered at. And the ballroom, the Grand Carter ballroom, where Clara Bennett had once stood invisible against the wall, holding a warm glass of lemonade, learning to disappear so well that even her own reflection forgot her name. That same ballroom became, for the rest of her days, the place where the whole valley gathered to hear what Clara Carter thought about the price of grain, and the terms of a loan, and the marrying of a daughter, and the settling of a quarrel. They came to her. The wall she'd leaned against for 10 unseen years became the room they filled to seek her out, and she would stand at the heart of it, where she'd never once believed she'd be permitted to stand, and give her counsel, plain and true, and they would listen because they had learned all of them, the thing it took a stolen road and a fallen family, and one relentless candlelit woman to teach them. The world had decided Clara Bennett's worth before it ever troubled to learn her story, had weighed her by a thin purse and a mended glove and a father's failed harvest, and found her nothing, and told her so for 10 long years against a ballroom wall. But her worth was never theirs to give, and it was never theirs to take, and in the end, she made them see it. Not by marrying up, not by being rescued, but by standing up on her own 2 feet, with her own sharp mind, and refusing ever again to disappear. And every soul on the Marsh Road, to the end of their days, knew the truth of her, the way you know a thing you watched with your own eyes, that the most valuable person in that whole rich valley had spent 10 years standing against a wall where no one would look, and that a person's true worth does not wait on the world's permission to be real. For it was real all along and always would be, whether they had eyes to see it or not.